Before we begin, if you appreciate the investigative work that goes into uncovering these stories, hit that like button and subscribe. What you're about to hear will stay with you long after this video ends. In November of 2025, people started noticing something deeply disturbing on Instagram. An account filled with artistic photographs of human remains, skulls arranged carefully, bones displayed like museum pieces, and beneath each post, a chilling message. If you know, you know. Skulls and bones available. DM to inquire. Whoever ran this account wasn't just sharing macabre photography. They were selling human remains, real human remains. But the cryptic phrase raised questions that wouldn't be answered for months. If you know, you know. Know what exactly? Then a video leaked. Origin unknown. It showed the inside of a house packed wall to wall with dead bodies, decomposing corpses hanging from hooks, mummified hands and feet arranged on shelves, torsos stacked in corners. And then, as quickly as it appeared, both the Instagram account and the leaked video vanished from the internet. But investigators had already documented everything. And what they discovered would reveal one of the most disturbing cases of grave robbery in American history. November 7th, 2025, 11:29 in the morning. Officers from the Yadon Police Department received a call directing them to Mount Moriah Cemetery in Pennsylvania. When they arrived, what they saw immediately raised alarm. The Hunter family mausoleum, previously sealed with cinder block and cement, had been forcibly opened. Someone had broken through. Inside, the marble floor had been shattered, exposing crypts nearly 10 feet below ground level. Among the debris, investigators found a screwdriver. Engraved on it multiple times was a name: Brian. A rope lay coiled nearby, clearly used to descend into the exposed crypts. One of those crypts belonged to Martha Hunter, a preteen girl who died in 1869, more than 150 years ago. The marble stone sealing her resting place had been pried open. Her remains were gone. Her clothing gone. Someone had stolen the body of a child, buried more than a century earlier. Police had barely begun processing the scene when they were called back to the same cemetery. November 29th, the Jonathan Pritchard family mausoleum. 5 of the 9 crypts inside had been robbed. But this time, the perpetrator left something behind: an empty can of Monster energy drink. Police recovered 2 partial fingerprints from the can. DNA swabs were taken from both the can and the screwdriver engraved with the name Brian. Whoever was doing this was getting bolder and sloppier. The age of the deceased didn't seem to matter, only the remains themselves. But the robbery spree wasn't limited to Mount Moriah. November 6th, 2025, a cemetery on the 1500 block of Westminster Road in Luzerne County, more than 100 miles from Mount Moriah. 2 sets of remains were stolen. Mary Capellina Poga, an 83-year-old woman who died in 1981, and Leo Terran, a 53-year-old man who also died that same year. 2 cigarette butts and 2 energy drink cans were collected and sent for DNA analysis. Throughout December, police were called to Mount Moriah at least 3 more times. 49 sets of remains were taken from 9 different family resting places. The cemetery sits on the border between Yadon and Philadelphia, and police soon became aware of 10 additional family plots burglarized in the Philadelphia section. By the end of December, the confirmed stolen bodies had reached 61. And that number doesn't include the 10 additional plots, since the exact number of corpses taken from those sites remains unknown. Investigators noticed patterns: cigarette butts at multiple scenes, empty energy drink cans, and in at least 2 mausoleums, broken wooden pallets propped upright, apparently used as makeshift ladders to climb in and out of underground vaults. The scale raised a disturbing question. What would drive someone to go through the extreme difficulty, the dishonor, the frankly disgusting work of exhuming so many dead bodies? And what on earth could they possibly be doing with them all? Barbara Cale Martin, who had family members buried at Mount Moriah, said it best. It's the last thing we can do for people, to honor their wishes and not disturb them. I just can't understand why somebody would do that. She wasn't alone in her confusion. But another question lingered. Why Mount Moriah? Established in 1855, the cemetery had long served as a final resting place for a wide range of Philadelphia's population. After the cemetery was abandoned by its owners, a volunteer group called Friends of Mount Moriah was formed in 2011 to restore the grounds and preserve the site as a place of quiet remembrance. Despite the volunteers' efforts, the cemetery remains run down. Overgrown vegetation, lack of consistent monitoring, its size alone made it difficult to patrol. It wasn't hard to imagine why someone's illicit actions might go unnoticed there. That changed on November 7th, when members of Friends of Mount Moriah contacted police after noticing signs of disturbance. As authorities continued investigating, they received a tip, an anonymous message that would crack the case wide open. Look into Jonathan Gerlach for the Luzerne County Mausoleum robbery. I know someone who's friends with his family, and they mentioned that they recently discovered a partially decomposed corpse hanging in his basement, but they were afraid to tell the police. Police took it seriously. Records showed that Jonathan Gerlach was charged on November 6, 2025, with shoplifting tools from a hardware store in East Earl Township, Lancaster County. The stolen items: a headlamp, a rechargeable LED glow stick, a hammer drill bit, medium-sized work gloves, a metal cutting wheel. Combined value, $167.43. Here's what made it suspicious. During the same visit, Gerlach paid for more than $250 worth of other merchandise. He could afford to pay, but he chose to steal the exact tools commonly associated with burglaries. Perhaps he thought stealing them would help him avoid detection. Instead, it had the opposite effect. The tipster also directed investigators to Gerlach's Instagram account. What they found was deeply troubling. Of the 147 posts on the account, only 2 showed Gerlach himself. The rest, human and animal, remains. In his most recent post, dated January 5, 2026, he wrote, "If you know, you know. Skulls/bones available. DM to inquire," followed by a pointing finger emoji and the words, "From my personal gallery." An earlier post from October 1st, 2024, contained just one word: sold. As police reviewed the account more closely, some of the most disturbing posts appeared to involve the remains of a child. In one, Gerlach wrote, "This precious little one, just 3 or 4 years old, has recently come under my guardianship to be honored and preserved. She will find a place in my private collection where she will be housed with the utmost respect." Nothing further was said about who the child was or where the remains came from. Was this skull from one of the multiple children's corpses stolen from Mount Moriah? And if supposedly restoring and handling them with care is Gerlach's defense, does that justify removing them from their resting place? Can a child's remains truly be honored and housed with respect if the caretaker is the same person who took her from her grave in the first place? While Gerlach claimed to keep some remains for his personal collection, others were allegedly sold, like the remains of a 6-month-old infant and those of a 3- or 4-year-old child whose skull was modified into what he called an exploding head. Dozens of other posts featured remains identified only as young adults or older individuals. The account also displayed animal remains, kittens, leopards, other wild cats. Some were listed as sold. One example, a Bengal tiger, posted March 20th, 2024, marked as sold for $2,000. In the caption, Gerlach described the item as ethically sourced/acquired. That same phrasing appeared repeatedly in earlier posts, applied not only to animal remains, but to human ones as well. In one post dated March 18th, 2024, he showed the skull of a woman he claimed was middle-aged and ended with the statement, "As always, ethically sourced/acquired, not for sale." However, in his later posts, specifically from the period when the grave robbings were taking place, those assurances of ethical sourcing were notably missing. He also appeared to be showcasing fewer remains for his personal gallery and focusing more on selling them. But what does ethically sourced even mean? And is there really a legal market for the sale of human remains? Surprisingly, yes. If you're finding this investigation compelling, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next case we uncover. And hit that like button to help others find this story. In recent years, human bones and modified remains have become increasingly visible on social media. The market includes a range of buyers, collectors of curiosities, ritual practitioners, a smaller number of contemporary artists and designers who incorporate human remains into sculptures or installations. Medical and dental students have also historically sought real skulls for study. There are, however, strict differences between legal anatomical preparation and illicit removal. In 2016, National Geographic reported that Skulls Unlimited was the only company in the United States legally processing donor skulls obtained directly through body donation programs. That company only sells donor skulls to verified professionals, doctors, dentists, anthropologists, others with legitimate scientific or medical needs. Skulls from the 18th, 19th, or early 20th century, which qualify as antique skulls, may be sold to the general public. At the federal level, there is no single U.S. law prohibiting the sale of human remains, with the exception of protections for Native American remains and certain state-level restrictions. As a result, collectors generally don't need credentials to buy or sell human skulls already on the market, so owning and trading human remains is not necessarily illegal. What matters is how they were originally acquired. Grave robbing itself is not new. For centuries, graves were disturbed to steal valuables buried with the dead. Body snatching, however, emerged as a more specific practice tied to the rise of modern medicine. By the late 18th century, advances in medical training and the growth of medical schools created a shortage of legally available bodies for dissection. This led to the rise of resurrectionists, individuals who exhumed the recently dead and sold the bodies to medical institutions. At the time, British law did not recognize buried bodies as property, allowing the practice to continue until legislation in 1832 reduced widespread grave robbing. But the demand persisted. Over time, India became a major supplier of human bones for Western medical study, driven by economic hardship and limited burial options. That trade ended in 1985 when the sale of more than 1,500 child skeletons was uncovered, prompting India to ban the export of human remains. While many remains in circulation today originated as donated anatomical specimens, the renewed demand for human bones has coincided with a resurgence in grave robbing. Because anybody can sell human remains, it's difficult to determine what has been ethically sourced. But there is a way to tell. Donated anatomical specimens often show signs of preparation: drilled holes, varnish, metal fittings. Remains taken directly from graves, by contrast, may exhibit soil staining, root etching, microfractures from long-term burial, or fragments of coffin wood, nails, or fabric still attached. Individually, these indicators are not definitive. Taken together, they help distinguish between remains prepared for study and those removed illegally from the ground. For example, Jonathan Gerlach's post from July 22, 2025 shows a human skull in which he draws particular attention to remaining nasal hair, neck hair, facial hair, eyebrows, eyelashes, and fine vellus hair. Another post from August 22, 2025 shows a skull with remnants of the eyes still present in the orbital sockets, visible hair on the skull itself, and signs of decomposition consistent with being buried in the ground. By contrast, legally obtained skulls from Skulls Unlimited typically show clear medical preparation, clean surfaces, consistent, standardized appearance. Even if we accept that remains can be ethically sourced, what is the morality of having a skull in your living room as decoration? As Jonathan Gerlach's story gained traction, so did his Instagram. In one post dated November 6, 2023, a user wrote, "Not going to lie, these pictures are beautiful." Thing is, these are remains of humans who have likely been dead for hundreds of years. Not saying it makes it right, but if I had been dead for so long that the world and any potential living relatives had long since gone themselves, I wouldn't be offended if some dude dug me up and took a few cool photos before dispersing my remains all over the place to people who love and appreciate that sort of thing. People might be grossed out, but there are others online who sell human bones. This comment brings up an argument, certainly. But if we're to take this comment seriously, the user is describing a personal belief, one in which they would consent to being exhumed, artistically photographed, and sold for profit after death. But here's the thing, not everyone would. Across cultures, and even within the same culture, death is viewed differently. People have different beliefs about the sanctity of remains, different wishes for what should and shouldn't be done to those remains after they die. Just because there are living people who don't believe remains are sacred and don't care what happens to their body after they die, doesn't mean those people should be able to decide what happens to the dead bodies of people who do care. What people choose to do with their bodies after death is their choice. And as far as it's possible, these wishes should be honored, even when they can't be. We should be mindful of a certain glorification of death and show respect for the life that came before. none of which can be said about Jonathan Gerlach's alleged actions. Breaking into crypts and stealing bodies is not what would qualify as being respectful of people's wishes, even when there aren't any living relatives of that person. If they were laid to rest in a cemetery, we can assume they didn't consent to being harvested for bones to be sold on Instagram. You might be wondering why we're spending so much time discussing the morality of grave robbing. It's obviously bad. But you'd be surprised to see how many have defended Gerlach online, saying that what he did isn't that bad. So we thought we should lay out the reasons why what he did is, in fact, that bad. At this point in the investigation, Jonathan Gerlach was still at large, free to desecrate the dead as he pleased. As police continued digging into his activities, another detail began to stand out. Among the followers on his Instagram account was a man named Brian, spelled the same way as the name repeatedly etched into the screwdriver recovered at one of the ransacked mausoleums. According to search warrants, the person who originally contacted police also told them that Brian had disappeared for several days in November and later mentioned he'd been in Chicago selling a human skull. Did this mean Jonathan Gerlach hadn't been acting alone? The same day they received the tip, investigators began tracking Gerlach's movements. December 23rd, Yadon police conducted a license plate reader search on Gerlach's Toyota RAV4. Records showed the vehicle had traveled into or near the areas where bodies were stolen on at least 5 occasions between November 2nd and December 17th, the same window of time when the thefts occurred. Court documents also stated that cell phone records placed him in those same areas at the same times. On December 23rd, a Yadon officer on patrol at Mount Moriah noticed a Toyota RAV4 parked between 2 fallen tree limbs inside the cemetery. Police believed the positioning was intentional, meant to conceal the vehicle. No one was inside, but multiple energy drink cans were visible on the front passenger seat. Later that evening, officers went to Gerlach's residence in Ephrata and saw the same vehicle parked outside. January 6th, detectives patrolling Mount Moriah again found Gerlach's Toyota parked near the cemetery. This time, police reported seeing human skulls and bones in the back seat. Gerlach was arrested shortly afterward when officers observed him walking back toward the vehicle, carrying a crowbar and a burlap sack containing a child's mummified remains. That same day, police executed a search warrant at Gerlach's home. Inside, they reported finding over 100 human skulls, numerous human long bones, mummified human feet and hands, 2 decomposing human torsos, and other assorted skeletal items. Not long after, an alleged leaked video from inside his house surfaced. The footage is disturbing. Voices can be heard reacting in shock. Look at the one hanging. Oh my God, at least there's a couple. Look at these ones, all the ones behind you. God damn. Oh, that one still has all 5. I want to get the hand. Wow, look at this. Oh my God, what the hell is that? A pacemaker. While the origin of the video couldn't be confirmed, several details suggested it may be authentic. At the 21st second mark, one of the people visible in the footage appears to be wearing a firearm in a holster, indicating they were likely police. Earlier in the clip, between 9 and 11 seconds, a couch is visible that closely resembles the fabric and design seen in the background of Gerlach's skull photographs. It's possible the couch, or a similar piece of furniture, was used as a backdrop for those images. Another detail drew particular attention online. A Reddit user known as CardioT pointed out a visible pacemaker in the footage, writing, "The pacemaker detail makes me think it's real. That is definitely a real pacemaker design. Looks like a Medtronic or a Boston Scientific. That specific set of remains will be able to be identified at least." A second user, Livid Moose 553, noted that the video was edited. According to their observation, the opening seconds show a storage unit, while the remainder of the footage appears to be filmed inside a basement. Whatever the origin of the video, it offered a disturbing glimpse of what Jonathan Gerlach's basement may have contained. According to authorities, Gerlach later admitted to stealing approximately 30 sets of human remains from Mount Moriah and described how he accessed the burial sites. January 7, 2026. District Attorney Tanner Rouse spoke at a press conference regarding the case. It is truly, in the most literal sense of the word, horrific. I grieve for those who are upset by this, who are going through it, who are trying to figure out if it is in fact their loved one or their child. Because we found remains that we believe to be month-old infants among those that he had collected. When Chief of Yeadon Police Henry Gertzio was asked if he had ever seen something similar, he replied, "No. After 30 years, no. I can say this is probably the most horrific thing that I've seen." And again, to the families, as the district attorney pointed out, we all have loved ones that passed. Rest in peace is rest in peace. And this is definitely something that tears your heartstrings, especially when you see, as he pointed out, an infant. Having children and grandchildren, yeah, it was definitely an event. Jonathan Gerlach was ultimately charged with 489 criminal counts, including 100 counts of corpse abuse. Additional charges include theft, burglary, intentional desecration of venerated objects, trespassing, criminal mischief, receiving stolen property, and desecration of historic burial sites. He was held in custody in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, on $1 million bail and was scheduled to appear at a preliminary hearing on January 20th. While there were no further developments regarding Brian, whose name was etched into a screwdriver found at one of the sites, District Attorney Tanner Rouse addressed the matter at a press conference. As of January 2026, Rouse stated that authorities did not believe Gerlach was working with anyone else and that no additional arrest warrants had been issued. Beyond the charges and court dates, this case leaves behind a deeper question. Death is an unavoidable part of life, but where is the line between embracing it and romanticizing it? Behind every set of remains was once a person who lived, made choices, and entrusted their body to the earth, their loved ones, or in some cases, to science. Regardless of the circumstances, human remains laid to rest are not meant to be collected for decor or profit. Because it's not only the dead who are wronged, but the living who trust that their final wishes will be respected. Now, let's shift to a completely different kind of criminal. Someone who started on the world stage as an athlete and ended up as one of the FBI's most wanted. Ryan Wedding, Olympic snowboarder, currently on the FBI's 10 most wanted for being a murderous drug lord. How does someone go from carving up slopes at the Olympics to being the most dangerous kingpin of an international empire built on, well, snow? The FBI first became aware of Ryan Wedding's activities on June 10, 2008, when 3 men landed at LAX in San Diego. 1 Russian, 1 Persian, 1 Canadian. They weren't there for business meetings or sightseeing. They were there to buy 24 kilos of cocaine from a former KGB agent. When they landed, the former KGB agent asked to see the money. The Canadian refused, saying, "Obviously, I didn't put it in my suitcase." This angered the ex-agent, but they found middle ground. They'd first buy 1 kilo, inspect it, then return for the rest. The next day, the Persian and Canadian visited a Persian rug store to pick up $120,000 in cash, wrapped in newspaper, and hid it in their hotel room. June 13th, the Russian left the hotel with $17,000 to buy the sample, while the other two waited in the room. After an hour and a half, they grew restless, hungry. They stepped out to get food and walked straight into an FBI trap. The deal had been a setup from the start. The ex-KGB agent was an FBI informant wearing a wire. The cocaine was supplied by the Bureau. The Russian and the Persian pled guilty, but the Canadian did not. At his 2010 sentencing, he pleaded with the judge. "What I did was completely out of character for me, and it's a personal mission of mine to rebuild my reputation. As an athlete, I was always taught that there are no second chances. And well, I'm here asking for exactly that." The man asking for forgiveness was none other than Olympic snowboarder Ryan Wedding. The judge showed leniency, handing down a sentence that seemed merciful at the time, a decision that would lead to a catastrophic series of events. 15 years later, Ryan would be on the FBI's 10 most wanted for murders all across North America and for being the kingpin of a billion-dollar international drug empire. This is the hunt for the Snow King. Ryan Wedding was born in 1981 in Thunder Bay, Ontario. By the time Ryan could walk, his grandfather already had him on skis. As a child, Ryan was described as bold and reckless, but also having strong focus. At age 12, shortly after his family moved to Coquitlam, British Columbia near Vancouver, he started snowboarding. Soon, he entered his first race and won. That's when he got noticed by Bob Allison, a former professional skier who was putting together an elite Canadian snowboarding team. In a 2009 interview with Rolling Stone, Bob Allison described Ryan as a child with no fear. A lot of kids say they want to go fast, but they don't really want to go fast. They hold something back because there's a little bit of fear there of falling. Ryan had none of that. By 15, he'd made the Canadian national team. He competed across the Alps and Andes, winning bronze at the Junior World Championships in 1999 and silver 2 years later. Commentators began comparing him to Ross Rebagliati, Canada's Olympic gold medalist. In 2002, at just 20 years old, Ryan Wedding was chosen to represent Canada at the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, Utah. It seemed like the start of a serious career. However, the day of the race, the weather had changed. The snow had softened, turning watery. When the race began, Ryan launched himself out of the chute. By the third gate, his line was off, but it was too late to fix. He finished 24th, just 1 second short of qualifying for the next round. Years of training had all led to that one moment, and in an instant, it was gone. Ross Rebagliati acknowledged Ryan's potential, but said he had everything in place to make it happen, but you've got to want it. And Ryan wanted something else. After Salt Lake City, that something else started to take shape. Not long after the Olympics, he enrolled at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. But instead of channeling his drive into academics, he focused on building his body. The slim Olympian became stockier, stronger. He began working nights as a bouncer. A friend from the time remembered his first shift. A fight broke out in the parking lot and spiraled into chaos. Cars screeched across the pavement, trying to run people over. One of the bouncers grabbed a hatchet from another person in the fight and smashed it into the hood of a car that came at them. It was around that time that Vancouver was starting to change. Random violence became common. What police didn't realize at the time was that the city was on the brink of a gang war, a fight for control over its marijuana trade. In the early 2000s, Vancouver sat just 25 miles from the longest unprotected border in North America. A pound of marijuana sold for about $2,000 on the streets. Across the border, it went for double. Between 2001 and 2004, shootings erupted in the city's clubs. Police began sweeping through bars, throwing out anyone who looked like a dealer. The old criminal group stayed quiet, but the new ones didn't. Peter Edwards, a Toronto Star reporter, explained, "Many of these were upper-middle-class kids. They went to good schools. What drew them to it was the image, the glamour. Flashy, reckless, eager to prove themselves. Their crimes became a kind of performance. The violence was public. Bodies left in cars, along the waterfront, in the street. Among the clubs caught in this storm was the one where Ryan worked. As other bouncers began wearing bulletproof vests, he told his mother he didn't need one. He wasn't scared. He was intrigued. Soon, Ryan found himself making friends with the same people he'd been hired to keep out. Friends with connections. Connections with opportunity. His girlfriend at the time noticed the shift, from the quiet family type who didn't care about status or appearance to the man wearing Prada shoes and Breitling watches. After 2 years of college, Ryan dropped out. With a $250,000 loan from his father, he bought and resold a house in Maple Ridge, a high-end suburb just outside Vancouver. The profit funded a luxurious new apartment in Westwood Plateau in Coquitlam, with high ceilings, a pinball machine, and a racing seat gaming setup. In the garage, he had snowmobiles, a Ducati, and a BMW M5. But even with the profit from the resold house, this lifestyle was too expensive for a bouncer. So wedding turned to something else, a business, quiet, profitable, illegal. The setup seemed perfect. His friend owned a property in Maple Ridge called the 18-Carat Farms, but instead of carrots, they planted cannabis. A confidential informant said Ryan and a partner were cultivating 8,000 marijuana plants. Twice a month, Ryan drove out, tended to the plants, and delivered product to a supplier. The operation was pulling in hundreds of thousands a year, maybe more. However, it was also pulling a lot of electricity, 2,000 kilowatt hours a month, far more than any typical warehouse. There were a few things that could explain that kind of energy use. One of them was marijuana grow lights. By the summer of 2006, the authorities had taken notice. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, raided the property. They found loaded guns in a locked safe, 6,800 cannabis plants, 86 pounds of dried marijuana, an estimated $10 million in value, the largest grow farm uncovered in Maple Ridge. But with only a confidential informant linking Ryan to the site, police never pressed charges. It wasn't surprising. Between 1997 and 2003, BC law enforcement investigated roughly 25,000 grow ops. Buildings reworked to produce large amounts of marijuana. But police couldn't keep up. So the priority shifted from prosecution to just shutting places down. In fall 2007, Ryan befriended Hassan Shirini, a Persian Canadian known to police since 1997. Shirini opened a new door for Ryan, the Hawala Network, a trust-based money transferring system dating back to the 8th century and still operating around the world today. Hawala, also called hundi, operates on trust and brokers, the Hawaladars. A client hands a Hawaladar cash and a fee. They agree on a code. The broker relays that code and details to a broker located where the recipient of the transfer lives. Payment is made locally. The actual funds are settled later between brokers, sometimes via internet or courier. It's efficient, discreet, global, and because it moves outside banks and traditional channels, the network can be exploited for criminal purposes. By 2007, Wedding was telling friends he was broke. He'd lost roughly $500,000 on a shady real estate deal, and per Shirini's later testimony, another $300,000 on a cocaine deal gone bad. According to Shirini, Wedding approached him about buying cocaine in California and said he could front about $340,000. After a series of meetings, including one with 2 men tied to Russian organized crime, they agreed to try for 24 kilos from a contact in LA. If it worked, they'd keep going. From the moment they arrived in LA, the FBI was watching. Wedding had never handled a deal this big, and to agents, it showed. He never asked where the cocaine was coming from. He appeared in person rather than using a middleman. The exchange ran through 2 Russians, Michael Karpchin and Yuri Trofimov. Karpchin feared Trofimov, an ex-KGB agent from a now-defunct secret police system whose reputation alone scared most people. June 10, 2008, Trofimov met them at the airport and demanded to see the cash. He was told they needed a few days to access it. Angry, he still agreed to the plan. Sell them a single kilo, then the rest later. The FBI had agents posted throughout the airport, ready to make an arrest. But when the plan shifted, they stood down. Wedding didn't look nervous. Agents said he acted like a tourist. He and Shirini visited malls, restaurants, hookah bars, and a Persian rug store that doubled as a Hawala broker. They picked up $120,000 there. The deal was on. June 13, 2008. As soon as Karpchin handed Trofimov $17,000 for 1 kilo, agents moved in. He was arrested on the spot. Wedding and Shirini were arrested next as they were leaving the hotel room in San Diego. Hours of recorded calls and meetings against them. Shirini and Karpchin agreed to plea deals. Hassan Shirini was sentenced to 18 months. Michael Karpchin, 30 months. But Ryan Wedding declined to cooperate. Brett Kina, a former FBI agent who arrested him, told Rolling Stone he was very controlled. Once we read him his rights, he didn't say anything. In the few instances, we did have the chance to interact with him when we were either picking him up from jail or dropping him off to make a proffer. He was kind of like, "You're not getting anything from me." Ryan remained quiet, but his demeanor showed disrespect for authority. During a jail transfer search, he used a homophobic slur against Agent Kina. The outburst was striking because it was unusual. Typically, when people are arrested, they try to make nice. They're vulnerable. They know who has the power at the moment and who doesn't, Kina explained. His trial was scheduled in San Diego for November 2009. His mother and sister attended in support. In court, Ryan Wedding's lawyer argued that Shirini had brought Wedding along as the fall guy. To create the impression that Wedding financed the operation, the lawyer said Shirini claimed his credit card was maxed out, pushing Wedding to cover daily expenses. When the conspirators discussed business by phone or in person, they often spoke Farsi or Russian, languages Ryan did not understand. And when speaking English, they used code, referring to the drugs as cars. Perhaps, the lawyer argued, Wedding really believed he was in Los Angeles to buy automobiles. When Hassan Shirini testified, he offered a different account. He failed to disclose that he'd managed the Hawala transfer to the Los Angeles drugstore and that he'd arranged for the drugs to be smuggled into Canada. But he insisted he handled only logistics. Wedding, he said, devised the scheme and put up most of the money. Ryan Wedding was convicted of conspiring to traffic cocaine. The mandatory minimum was 10 years. But Agent Brett Keena believed Wedding understood that there was a strong chance he would be transferred to a Canadian facility where the term would be substantially reduced. During the 2 years between arrest and conviction, Wedding was held in San Diego at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, a place that, for him, seemed to have done more training than correcting. Agent Keena admitted, this was only the beginning for Ryan. You've got people in that facility that have amazing drug world connections. We really did just turn him into a much better drug dealer than he was when he started with us. The Metropolitan Correctional Center holds inmates awaiting trial or sentencing for a range of federal offenses, including lower-level members of Mexican drug trafficking organizations, particularly mules who specialize in moving drugs across the border. While there, Wedding organized up to 5 girlfriends back home to wash his car, clean his apartment, and collect money from associates to pay creditors. He also phoned male associates, boasting about the good connections he was making in custody. Meanwhile, in court, he sang a completely different tune. What I did was completely out of character for me, and it is a personal mission of mine to rebuild my reputation, he told the judge. And they bought it. The court imposed a lower term than initially intended, 48 months minus time served. Ryan Wedding hadn't lied to the court, at least not entirely. He did plan to rebuild, but it wouldn't be the kind of rehabilitation the judge had in mind. What he took with him back to Canada wasn't a desire to live the life of a law-abiding citizen. It was experience that acted as the foundation for his future criminal empire. If you're still watching, you're clearly invested in these stories. Do me a favor and hit that like button if you haven't already. And subscribe so you're here for the next investigation. When Ryan Wedding returned to Canada, he settled in Montreal, a city in transition. The drug trade, once dominated by the Mafia, was now open territory. Brian Fitzpatrick, a senior investigative reporter with the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, explained, in Canada, it's not as regimented as Mexico, where certain cartels control key corridors or plazas. It's much more entrepreneurial. You might work with the Sinaloa cartel, and there's someone else a couple towns over who does as well, and you don't even know each other exists. By the early 2010s, one drug kingpin was already making inroads into Canada, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, who had risen to become the most powerful drug trafficker in the world. Under his command, the Sinaloa cartel expanded into one of the largest drug smuggling networks in history. At the time, the cartel was operating in more than 50 countries and responsible for the bulk of narcotics crossing the US-Mexico border. In the 2010s, its attention turned north. Canada, with its high street prices and relatively light federal drug enforcement compared to the US, was seen as a strategic safe zone, a place where cartel operatives could meet international partners and arrange shipments of drug precursors. The cartel's expansion into Canada caught American authorities off guard. According to U.S. investigators, cocaine shipments were smuggled across the border into Arizona, stored in a warehouse in Tucson or Phoenix, then transported by vehicle to the Washington, British Columbia border. From there, the drugs were loaded onto helicopters and dropped into forested areas on the Canadian side. But law enforcement had plans of their own. An officer identified in court records only as Joe infiltrated Canada's underground drug market as part of a sting operation known as Operation Harrington, designed specifically to disrupt the cocaine pipeline between Mexico and Canada. Meanwhile, by February 2014, Ryan Wedding had filed for bankruptcy. In a sworn statement, he claimed to be unemployed. British Columbia bankruptcy records showed he was leasing a new Ford F-350 pickup and living in a gated condo complex in Coquitlam with his wife. Despite this, Wedding declared that neither of them had any income. On paper, he was relying solely on financial support from family members. I, due to being in prison for several years, unable to work and contribute to the household, was unable to fulfill my financial obligations as they became due, Wedding wrote. That was the public version. Privately, something else was underway. January 2015. The undercover officer Joe traveled to Montreal to meet with a man named Filipos Koulouros, identified in court documents as having direct ties to El Chapo. According to the records, at their meeting, Koulouros told Joe that he'd brought the man in charge. Moments later, Ryan Wedding walked in and introduced himself as a cocaine importer. From the moment Joe met Wedding, he realized immediately that he was dealing with a seasoned operator. Wedding asked detailed questions about boat capacity, mapped out transfer routes. Together, they came up with a plan. A large research vessel would collect the shipment from St. Kitts, then transfer it mid-sea to a fleet of smaller fishing trawlers, which would deliver the load discreetly to shore in Newfoundland. They agreed on a test run, between 500 and 1,000 kilograms of cocaine, with Joe taking a 25% cut of the shipment's value as his fee. But before anything could move forward, the plan was shut down. April 20th, 2015. The RCMP launched coordinated raids across Canada and issued 15 arrest warrants. Among those named were Ryan Wedding and Filipos Koulouros. It remains unclear whether Koulouros cooperated with the Crown, but in the end, he served just 1 day in prison, as the rest was covered by time already spent in custody. Then, on the evening of November 7th, 2018, Koulouros was sitting in a coffee shop in Montreal's Little Italy when a man entered the cafe and shot him. He died that night in the hospital. The murder was never solved, but there was one clear person of interest, someone with motive and reason to fear what Koulouros might say to authorities: Ryan Wedding. Koulouros had knowledge of the St. Kitts plot. If brought to trial, he could have testified. But by then, Wedding was no longer in Canada. When the RCMP arrived at his Montreal condo in 2015 to make the arrest, he was already gone. Authorities believe he fled the country and went straight into the protection of the Sinaloa cartel. But while in hiding, Ryan Wedding would become more dangerous than ever. Little is known about his exact movements in the years that followed, but the consequences of his decisions were felt, often far from view, and sometimes by those with no part in his world. On the morning of November 20th, 2023, 28-year-old Jasprit Kaur Sidhu was woken by her father, Jagtar Singh Sidhu, 57. They had argued days earlier, but that morning there was an urgency in his voice. He told her, "If we don't talk today, it will be never." Before leaving, he said, "Remember one thing. The day I die, I will tell myself that I love my daughter more than anyone else in this world." Jagtar and his wife, Harbhajan Kaur Sidhu, 55, had been visiting from India for 4 months. They were staying with Jasprit and her brother Garrett at their rental home on Mayfield Road, near the Caledon-Brampton border. The couple planned to return to India in January. Until then, their visit had been peaceful. But late that night, around 11:30 p.m., everything changed. Jasprit was getting ready for bed when she saw a man standing in the hallway. She saw her father collapse from gunfire, heard her mother scream. Then there was complete silence except for the sounds of gunshots. Downstairs, her close friend, Simranjit Sunny Singh, had heard the gunfire. He rushed outside and saw the shooter flee in the back of a pickup truck with at least one other person inside. When they were gone, he returned to the house to find Jagtar motionless outside the bathroom. There was no pulse. His wife Harbhajan, shot multiple times, was still breathing, but barely. According to the family, police arrived nearly 20 minutes after the first 911 call. The ambulance took another 10 minutes. Harbhajan, who had been shot a total of 22 times, died in the hospital nearly 2 weeks later. Her daughter Jasprit, shot 13 times, survived. Most of the bullets were removed, but one remains lodged in her spine. Doctors determined that removing it would carry a high risk of paralysis or coma. At first, investigators were at a loss. Why would someone target a quiet, ordinary family with such brutality? The answer came later when the investigation was handed over to the FBI, who alleged that the Sidhus were targeted by mistake. According to agents, the shooter, still unidentified, was working for Ryan Wedding. He'd been sent in response to a stolen drug shipment. The Sidhus, they believe, had nothing to do with it. For federal investigators, the killing of Jagtar and Harbhajan Sidhu became yet another tragic example of the damage caused by the global drug trade. But for their children, Jasprit and Garrett, the impact was direct. Jasprit spent 7 months in the hospital. When she finally stood again, she needed assistance with even routine tasks. Trauma lingers. She says she still hears her mother's screams every day. "I can never forget that," she said. Speaking about Wedding, her words were clear. He will have to face his karma. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, Ryan Wedding expanded his drug smuggling operation into a billion-dollar enterprise, moving an estimated 60 tons of cocaine each year, valued at nearly $500 million, primarily through the United States, and into Canada. Over time, he accumulated a series of aliases: R.W. James Conrad King, Buddy, Giant, Public Enemy, El Toro, Elf. Behind the scenes, Wedding constructed a network. People he could trust to carry out orders and keep the supply chain moving. One of them was Jonathan Acevedo Garcia, a Colombian-Canadian from Montreal who worked in his family's cleaning business. In 2009, U.S. agents stopped Acevedo Garcia at the New York-Ontario border and found 23,000 ecstasy pills laced with methamphetamine in his car. He pled guilty to drug trafficking conspiracy and received a 4-year sentence, part of which he served at Reeves County in Texas, where he likely met Wedding. By 2024, police say Acevedo Garcia was working directly with Wedding's second-in-command, Andrew Clark. a Toronto-based elevator mechanic in his 30s who had relocated to Mexico in 2022. Acevedo Garcia helped coordinate Wedding's drug logistics from a distance. While he organized shipments, Wedding and Clark were focused on eliminating any threats to their organization. Clark had taken interest in a young man named Malik Cunningham, who had just been released from the Toronto South Detention Center. Clark arranged for Cunningham to travel to Mexico, where he underwent weapons training ranging from small arms to long-range rifles under a program modeled on military instruction. Once trained, he was sent back to Canada. With names, his first assignment came with a payment of $100,000. The target? Randy Federer, a 29-year-old American-Canadian citizen. April 1st, 2024, Cunningham traveled to Federer's home in Niagara and shot him at close range in his driveway before fleeing. The motive remains unclear, but police believe Federer had drawn the negative attention of the Wedding network. With that killing carried out, Clark began preparing Cunningham for additional jobs. One contact offered $200,000 to kill a real estate agent in Vancouver. Another promised more than twice the amount for a group in Toronto. A third listed a target in Dubai for $1 million. All were described as enemies of ELF. Then, on April 14th, 2024, Cunningham made a critical mistake. He was spotted driving the same vehicle he'd used in the Federer shooting. The car, fitted with fraudulent license plates, was parked outside a funeral home in the Greater Toronto area, where mourners had gathered following another homicide. Officers from York Regional Police approached, suspecting the vehicle was stolen, and took Cunningham into custody. Inside the car, they found 4 mobile phones, multiple rounds of ammunition, and $100,000 in cash. When investigators searched the devices, they uncovered encrypted messages exchanged between Cunningham and Clark. Messages that prosecutors say laid out the structure and scope of the murder-for-hire plot. This was the beginning of the FBI's Operation Giant Slalom, and more arrests followed soon after. Authorities arrested Ratan Singh at his home in Ontario on charges of conspiracy to export, possess, and distribute controlled substances. Andrew Clark was arrested on October 8th in a restaurant in Guadalajara on 11 charges, including conspiracy to possess, export, and distribute cocaine, 4 counts of murder, and 1 count of attempted murder. He was later extradited to the United States. In total, 14 men were arrested, 8 of them Canadian. Malik Cunningham, charged alongside Clark in the killing of Randy Federer, is scheduled to appear before a Toronto court in January 2026. At a press conference held days after Clark's arrest in October, the FBI announced a $50,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and extradition of Ryan Wedding. Speaking to reporters, U.S. Attorney Martin Estrada stated, "He chose to become a major drug trafficker, and he chose to become a killer." By early 2025, authorities were preparing for trial, and Jonathan Acevedo Garcia was expected to be a central witness. But on January 31st, while eating lunch at a shopping mall in Medellin, Colombia, Acevedo Garcia was allegedly shot and killed. The attack was carried out in public, in broad daylight, and it threw the prosecution's case into disarray. Without him, the government lost a key piece of direct testimony, one that had been intended to tie several of Wedding's associates directly to the operation, although at the time there was no direct confirmation from law enforcement that he was killed. During a virtual court appearance, Ratan Singh's lawyer, Brian Greenspan, noted, "There has never been an admission that he is dead, although we all know he's dead." As a result, the trial was postponed to 2026. In March of 2025, Clark pled not guilty to all charges in a California federal courtroom. Though the killings took place in Canada, prosecutors alleged that they were ordered as part of a broader U.S. criminal conspiracy. His trial, too, has been delayed, now rescheduled for February 2026. March 6, 2025. Ryan Wedding was officially added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. That same day, the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs announced a reward of up to $10 million for information leading to his arrest or conviction, building on the FBI's existing $50,000 reward. At a press conference, senior Bureau official F.C. Courtright Whelan stated, "We are committed to protecting American communities from thugs who, with clear consciences, deliberately peddle illicit narcotics and prey on our youth." November 19th, 2025, the U.S. Justice Department, the FBI, and the RCMP held a joint press conference. During the announcement, U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi revealed that a newly unsealed indictment accuses Ryan Wedding of coordinating the murder of a key witness ahead of his scheduled testimony. According to prosecutors, Wedding had photographs of the witness and his wife posted to a website called Dirty News in an effort to assist co-conspirators in locating the pair. The murder took place in Medellin, Colombia, on January 31st, 2025. The site has since been seized and taken offline as part of Operation Giant Slalom. Although authorities did not release the witness's name, the timing of the killing aligns with the alleged murder of Acevedo Garcia. During the press conference, U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi stated, "Today we're unsealing a new indictment charging Wedding with 2 additional counts of witness tampering and intimidation, murder, money laundering, and drug trafficking." November 18, 2025. 10 alleged associates of Wedding, including 7 Canadians, were arrested and charged under the expanded indictment. Among those arrested were Gursawak Singbal of Mississauga, identified by authorities as a co-owner of the Dirty News website. Another defendant, Canadian-Dominican reggaeton artist Edwin Basora Hernandez, is accused of providing the victim's contact details to help Wedding's group locate him. Also taken into custody was Deepak Paradar, a lawyer for Ryan Wedding. According to Billis, First Assistant U.S. Attorney to the Central District of California, Paradar put up a little bit of resistance during the arrest. His lawyer advised him to kill the witness. When you have lawyers who are assisting international drug trafficking players on how to evade law enforcement and to murder witnesses, we can't have that stand. RCMP Commissioner Mike Duheme also addressed the public during the press conference. "I want to emphasize that our work is not done. Fugitive Ryan Wedding remains one of the top threats to Canadian public safety and, as per the previous indictment, continues to run an over $1 billion a year criminal enterprise." Authorities believe Wedding is currently in Mexico, but his presence in the United States, Canada, Colombia, Honduras, Guatemala, Costa Rica, and other locations has not been ruled out. He is described as 6'3" or 190 centimeters, approximately 240 pounds or 108 kilograms. His eyes are blue, his hair brown, and he may be wearing a beard or mustache. The FBI has urged anyone with information on Wedding's whereabouts to reach out via WhatsApp, Signal, or telegram. Tipsters may also contact the nearest FBI office, U.S. Embassy, or consulate and submit a tip online. All submissions will be treated confidentially. The transformation from Olympic athlete to billion-dollar drug lord, from someone trusted to represent a nation to someone who orders the executions of innocent families. It raises uncomfortable questions about ambition, identity, and what happens when someone loses their way. And wedding is still out there. Now let's turn to a case that involves not just one corrupt cop, but two, and their crimes were so shocking that they shattered trust in one of the most famous police departments in the world. We've covered multiple criminal cases on this channel that were completely botched by law enforcement, either because of incompetence or unwillingness to act. But this next story is about something much worse. In fact, it's the most extreme case of police corruption we've ever seen. A whole string of murders in New York, where the killers that detectives were supposed to be looking for were themselves. Evening of November 6th, 1990. 48-year-old Eddie Leno was driving home after finishing work for the day. As he neared Brighton Beach, an unmarked Crown Victoria sedan fell in behind him and flashed police lights. Leno pulled over, expecting nothing more than another routine encounter. Two men approached, badges visible, so he lowered his window. One plainclothes detective asked him, "What's that on the floor?" As he looked down, he was shot 9 times at close range and left slumped inside his car. The two shooters returned to their vehicle and vanished into the night. But the perpetrators of this murder, as well as many others, were not killers impersonating the police. They were the police. Detectives who not only worked for a secret crime organization, they killed for them. In 1987, the first signs of killers hiding in the New York Police Department began to show. October 8th, NYPD officer Philip Salmon was responding to a report of a man being gunned down in the street in broad daylight when he was surprised to realize that he recognized the victim. They worked out at the same gym. He didn't know much about him, only that his name was Otto and that he was an ex-convict. No matter what time of day I went to the gym, he was there. It was pretty obvious he didn't have a 9-to-5 job, Officer Salmon recalled. The officer was right. John Otto Heidel was no ordinary man. He was a former member of the Bypass Gang, a highly organized crew of alarm experts, safe crackers, and professional burglars. But besides that, he was a longtime informant for the FBI. Under Agent Patrick Colgan, he had earned a total of $100,000 for intelligence regarding upcoming thefts. For his own protection, Heidel's status as an informant was so restricted that only his handler, Agent Colgan, knew his identity. Not even Colgan's supervisors were aware of the arrangement. Heidel's work for the FBI continued secretly for years, but then suddenly on February 14th, 1987, Heidel contacted Colgan in a panic. He said his longtime friend Anthony Casso, the underboss of the Lucchese crime family, had casually mentioned that a detective in the 63rd Precinct was sharing inside information with him. More alarming, Casso's cop informant apparently had access not only to NYPD files, but also to intelligence from the FBI and DEA. Colgan took Heidel's concerns seriously enough to file a report noting suspected police corruption, but for some reason, no one followed up, at least not with him. At the same time, Agent Colgan began to suspect Heidel was still active in robberies. when his suspicion was later confirmed by another informant. Heidel's informant status was revoked per bureau policy, and he was reclassified as a cooperating witness, meaning his identity would no longer be protected. From that point on, anyone involved in the investigation would have access to that information. That summer, Heidel ran into Bert Kaplan, a drug trafficker and criminal strategist, and Jimmy Petruccia, a hitman working for the Bonanno family, one of the La Cosa Nostra, the Italian crime society, more commonly known as the Mafia. They were all at El Caribe, a beach club frequently used by the 5 families of the Mafia. Heidel was walking around after a recreational racquetball match when Tommy confronted him. "Personally, I think you're a stool pigeon," slang for a police informant. Heidel stood in shock and denial, but Tommy wasn't convinced, and neither was Kaplan, who observed the situation and informed Anthony Casso. Casso asked Kaplan to consult their crystal ball, the nickname he often used to refer to their mole inside the NYPD. The turncoat detective, whose identity was a mystery even to Casso himself, eventually relayed a confirmation. Heidel was a problem that needed to disappear. October 8th, as Heidel was walking back to his car after a handball match, he discovered that it had a flat tire, a common Mafia setup. As he crouched down to fix it, 2 men pulled up and opened fire. Heidel was hit multiple times but managed to flee. The car followed him up a one-way street and shot him again at close range. Heidel died on the spot. Immediately after news of the hit reached headquarters, a detective from the 63rd Precinct rushed to Heidel's apartment. They needed to recover any sensitive informant materials before they fell into the wrong hands. Inside the bathroom, the officer found microcassette tapes, recordings related to Heidel's work with the FBI. However, instead of immediately logging, labeling, and preserving the evidence per protocol, the officer left the tapes out in the open in a supervisor's office near the squad room. As a result, someone at the precinct was able to pocket one of the cassette tapes and hand it over to Bert Kaplan. "This will prove that I was right, that the guy was cooperating, and that he was taping people," said the crystal ball. Heidel's murder only marked the beginning of the fruitful relationship between Casso and his dirty detective. Just 4 days later, October 12, 1987, an informant named Dominic Costa was backing into his home garage just after midnight when 2 masked men approached and opened fire. He was hit twice in the head and once in the shoulder. Months earlier, Detective Chuck Seriano had discovered that Dominic Costa, a 26-year-old former Marine sniper, was working for the Bypass Gang. Costa led a double life, a licensed locksmith and safe technician by day, an expert safe cracker by night. He claimed to have cracked over 300 safes and was occasionally hired to fix the very ones he'd broken into the night before. After surveilling Costa for 6 months, Seriano and 2 other detectives failed to gather enough evidence to place him under arrest. But Costa didn't know this. So, hoping intimidation would be enough, they picked him up anyway. And they were right. When threatened with prison, Costa cracked immediately and agreed to wear a wire. Costa revealed he'd agreed to help the Bypass Gang break into 5 safes for an upcoming burglary. Detective Seriano decided to let the burglary go forward in order to catch the crew in the act. It all seemed to be going well, until 5 weeks before the operation, when Detective Seriano got a call with shocking news. Costa had been shot in the head, but miraculously, Costa survived Paramedics revived him and rushed him to Kings County Hospital. "They broke my skull in half, but I'm still alive," he later said. Despite surviving, the damage was permanent. His right eye drooped. A bump formed on his forehead, and he suffered recurring seizures. Then, just 1 week after the attempt on Dominic Costa's life, another informant, 28-year-old Victor Felico, a low-level associate, was found dead in the trunk of his BMW in Bay Ridge. This sequence of events, 3 informants hit in a matter of weeks, led officers to think there was a good possibility that the Mafia had a mole inside the major case squad. This changed how Detective Seriano operated from then on. A month later, after arresting another man willing to cooperate, he avoided filing standard paperwork altogether. Instead, he processed the case through the Manhattan DA's office outside the department's normal chain of command. Back at the organized crime unit, Seriano's desk sat directly across from his longtime colleague, Stephen Caracappa. As Seriano began bypassing internal paperwork, Caracappa took notice. The mood in the unit shifted. Tension grew. No one had proven that a leak existed, but the signs were becoming impossible to ignore. Was Seriano keeping information out of the system because he was being cautious? Or was he actually the mole? Robert Intertaglia, an investigator in the Brooklyn DA's office, said, "You couldn't help but feel that the wise guys were on to us. Leaks are the worst things that can happen." And yet, they kept happening. In May 1990, Casso's crystal ball delivered the biggest warning yet. A federal grand jury in Brooklyn had just handed down indictments. The charges were severe. Casso, the boss of the Lucchese family, Vic Amuso, and over a dozen others were accused of manipulating and controlling a $143 million contract to replace windows for the housing authority. By the morning of May 15th, Vic Amuso had left New York, going into hiding in Pennsylvania. Casso, on the other hand, hesitated. Leaving felt like surrender, like an admission that the 5 families were losing grip on New York. Still, he had to leave. He broke the news to his wife Lillian over dinner and used his final days to tie up loose ends. Then, on the night of May 24th, he met with Alfonso Darko, the man selected to serve as acting boss in his and Vic Amuso's absence. Darko wasn't the typical image of a mafia boss. He was short, quiet, lived in a cramped apartment in Little Italy, but he was loyal, disciplined, and dependable. To Casso, that was enough. Just like his crystal ball had said, on May 30th, federal agents knocked on Casso's door. But of course, he was already gone. While the FBI searched the Upper East Side home, other agents were striking down across the city. They arrested 12 men, union officials and high-ranking members of multiple crime families accused of corrupting the city's public housing contracts. The old world mafia, once untouchable, now looked fractured and exposed. The Mafia is not the entrenched, well-insulated organization it once was. It's getting weaker and weaker, said FBI agent Jules Bonavolanta. However, law enforcement was one step too late. Amuso and Casso had escaped, and somehow the distance only made Casso more dangerous. From his hideout in Mount Olive, New Jersey, he ordered more than 30 killings, guided by the same crystal ball. If this story is pulling you in, make sure you like this video and subscribe. There's so much more to uncover, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Before going into hiding in early 1990, Anthony Casso called in Anthony DeLappy to review the accounting for a bookmaking operation. DeLappy had once been a powerful figure within the Lucchese family. but after serving 10 years in prison, his standing had faded. The meeting was routine, meant to ensure Delapi paid proper tribute to the higher-ups. But Delapi hadn't been keeping his books straight, and worse, he didn't show up. Using his crystal ball, Casso tracked him to Los Angeles and assembled a 4-man team to carry out the hit. Months later, while in hiding, Casso received new information from his dirty detective. Bruno Facciolo, a trusted enforcer with 30 years of service, had supposedly given up names to the cops of Mafia members connected to Delapi's murder. That was all Casso needed to hear. August 24th. Police found Facciolo's body in the trunk of his car, with a dead canary in his mouth. Casso's warning to all those who might sing to law enforcement. The FBI would later conclude Facciolo hadn't informed at all. It seemed Casso's inside intel wasn't always correct, but he was leaning on it more than ever, even going so far as sending his cop friend to kill for him. Normally, he relied on his own men for hits, but this target was too important. Eddie Lino, a lieutenant for John Gotti, the boss of the Gambino family. Before John Gotti took control of the Gambino family, the boss was Paul Castellano. At the time, Anthony Casso approached Castellano with a warning that Angelo Ruggiero, one of his trusted men, was working as an informant. Castellano didn't believe him. He stood by Ruggiero, calling him loyal. But when Ruggiero demanded permission to retaliate against Casso for the accusation, Castellano refused. Then John Gotti staged a coup. He assassinated Castellano and took control of the family. Under Gotti's rule, Ruggiero finally got permission to strike back against Casso. Evening of September 14th, 1986. 4 years before he went into hiding, Casso drove to the Golden Ox, a small restaurant tucked beside an ice cream shop. He was supposed to meet an acquaintance about a stolen check scheme, but the meeting was a setup. As Casso waited in his car, a car with tinted windows rolled up beside him. Inside were Jimmy Heidel, Bob Baring, and Nicky Guido. A shotgun barrel appeared at the window. The blast tore through Casso's car door. Shots shattered glass and ripped into his shoulder. Casso ducked under the steering wheel, grabbing his gun. He slid across the seat, pushing open the opposite door, exited the vehicle, and ran toward the Golden Ox, while the gunman fired from the parking lot. He stumbled inside, bleeding. Diners froze as he limped toward the kitchen, then down to the basement. There, he hid inside a walk-in refrigerator, waiting either for police or the shooters to find him. When neither came, he slipped out a back door and called his friend Vic Amuso, who drove him to the hospital. Physically, Casso recovered, but the attempted hit had humiliated him. He was the underboss of the Lucchese family, and he wasn't going to let this go. He swore revenge, not just on the men who tried to kill him, but on everyone tied to Castellano's murder, and one of them was Eddie Lino. Fast forward back to November 6th, 1990. Lino's body was found slumped in his Mercedes on the side of the Belt Parkway. He'd been shot through the open driver's window, and there was no shattered glass, which likely meant he'd rolled the window down himself to speak with someone, perhaps a police officer who had pulled him over. The shooter left one clue: a black-faced wristwatch with a broken band lying in the dirt 15 feet from the car. The hands had stopped at 7 p.m., right around the time of the hit. At the Major Case Squad office, Detective Chuck Seriano was talking with his longtime friend, Detective Stephen Caracappa, about the shooting. Seriano made a lighthearted comment about how careless the killer had been, leaving a wristwatch behind at the scene. But as the words left his mouth, Caracappa's expression changed. His face went still, serious. It was just for a moment, but did Caracappa know more about that shooting than he was letting on? Outside the traditional Mafia hierarchy stands a man who was always by the boss's side. Not a capo, not a consigliere, but a driver, a bodyguard, a shadow. For Gambino's boss, John Gotti, that man was Bobby Borriello. Casso had known that Gotti's crew was behind the failed attempt on his life, so it didn't come as a surprise to him when Bert Kaplan played Casso a tape delivered to them by their crystal ball. On it, Borriello's voice came through loud and clear. These guys missed with Casso, and they better take care of this thing, or I'm going to get mad and I'll drive right into his driveway and kill him and his whole family. That was it. Borriello was now a dead man walking. A few weeks before the hit, a heavy-set man showed up at the Borriello home in Brooklyn's Bath Beach neighborhood. Bobby Borriello's wife, Susan, answered the door. He flashed a badge, revealed a gun, and said he was a detective, but never gave a name. "Does Bobby Borriello live here?" the detective asked. Susan told the detective her husband wasn't home. The man said he'd be back, but he never returned, at least as far as she knew. April 13th, 1991. Bobby spent the afternoon at the Aqueduct racetrack. That evening, just after 7:30 p.m., he pulled into his driveway. Susan was inside feeding their toddler when she heard the gunshots. Bobby's nephew ran outside and found him slumped next to his car. 10 shell casings were strewn across the pavement, but the shooter had already vanished. By 1991, the old rules that bound the 5 families together were crumbling. The Mafia's code, once sacred, was being buried under a wave of paranoia, botched hits, and whispered betrayals. Even loyalists were starting to glance over their shoulders. Alphonse Little Aldarco had been one of them, acting boss of the Lucchese family, handpicked by Casso. But after made man Peter Chiodo flipped to aid law enforcement after surviving a failed hit ordered by Casso, Casso blamed Darko for not cleaning up the mess. So when Darko walked into a hotel meeting and spotted a known hitman in a stiff, bulletproof-looking sweatshirt, he didn't want to find out if he was next on Casso's kill list. He walked out, and 3 days later, he called the FBI. This was law enforcement's big break. Darko wasn't just a capo or soldier. He was the highest-ranking mobster to ever defect at that point. A man who'd stood beside bosses, knew where bodies were buried, and more importantly, knew where Casso was getting his information. Darko said that he'd heard about the crystal ball, and now, for the first time, law enforcement had confirmation that the leak was real. One of their own was secretly working for the Mafia. Meanwhile, the Lucchese family was falling apart. Half of the crew was either informants, dead, or behind bars, and the bosses were on the run. Anthony Casso and Vica Musso had been hiding for almost a year when the TV show America's Most Wanted aired their profiles. 4 months later, the FBI got a tip. A Musso was regularly using a payphone at a mall in Dixon City, Pennsylvania. They waited, and at the right moment, arrested him outside a pharmacy in the mall complex on July 28, 1991. He was charged with racketeering, extortion, fraud, bribery, and 9 murders. With Al Darko testifying as star witness, Vica Musso was convicted on all 54 counts and sentenced to life without parole. He walked out of the courtroom smiling. Don North, an agent who helped supervise the FBI investigation, said, "We're getting closer, and Amuso's conviction will turn Casso up soon. The question is whether it will turn him up alive or dead." By December 1992, Anthony Casso, then 52 years old, had been in hiding for 31 months. He believed that if he stayed underground long enough, the pressure around his arrest would eventually fade. But it didn't. A new indictment accused Casso of ordering 11 murders and conspiring to kill 3 more. U.S. Attorney Andrew Maloney said, "He is the most dangerous, cunning, and ruthless mafia leader on the streets. He is number 1 on our hit parade of wanted criminals." Their next break came on January 19th, 1993. That Monday morning, Casso made a phone call to one of his men to send roses and a note to his mother for her birthday. After that, he went upstairs to take a shower. Unbeknownst to him, the FBI had been listening in on the call, and by 11 a.m. that morning, they had his house surrounded. They knocked once and announced themselves. When no one answered the door, they broke in. They were armed and ready, but the most dangerous mafia leader wasn't. Anthony Casso came down with his hands raised and a towel around his waist. Agents cuffed Casso and took him to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. But Anthony Casso wasn't ready to accept his life sentence without a few more tricks. He bribed a guard to smuggle in hot meals and wine from Little Italy. And when the guard seemed trustworthy enough, he planned his escape. 3 times he tried. 3 times he failed. Anthony Casso had been behind bars for nearly a year, when one day he saw a story on the news. Sammy the Bull Gravano, underboss of the Gambino family, had flipped. After prosecutors played tapes of John Gotti mocking him behind his back, Gravano agreed to cooperate. In return, he got a reduced sentence, early release, and a spot in witness protection. It became clear to Casso, no matter your record, the feds would let you off with a light sentence as long as you agreed to testify. Casso had spent his career hunting informants and killing most of them. But now, in a tight cell, Casso was questioning the old mafia codes. Half of the Lucchese family was locked up or dead. The rest were testifying. So a question raised in his head: what was there left to stay loyal to? And so, during his next meeting with law enforcement, Casso turned toward FBI agent Richard Rudolph and said, "If you guys make me a good offer, I'll work with you." The agent was surprised. The man prosecutors had nicknamed Lucifer was ready to flip. The agreement was sealed with a handshake. What they didn't realize at the time is just how destructive the information provided by Casso would be. During his interview with federal agents, Anthony Casso didn't hesitate. One law enforcement officer told the New York Daily News he was extremely forthcoming. Casso knows a lot of specifics about a lot of crimes. At his plea hearing, he admitted to 15 murders, but in the quiet of the debriefing room, he corrected himself. The real number was 37. He talked about racketeering, drug operations, labor schemes, every corner of his criminal world. But then came something else, a detail that shook the very foundation of New York's justice system. Casso claimed he had not 1 but 2 longtime moles inside the NYPD. Not low-level cops either, high-ranking detectives. For years, he said, they fed him classified information, surveillance updates, wiretap locations, names of informants, and more than that, they had killed for him, often. Anthony Casso hadn't known their names for a long time, but he had seen them. Once, his intermediary, Bert Kaplan, had kept any information about their identities to himself. But in 1992, Casso read a book, Mafia Cop, a memoir by a former detective, and in the book, there was a photo. He recognized the faces immediately. Underneath were their names, Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa. Before they ever did Anthony Casso's dirty work, Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa were partners in the NYPD. On paper, they were a mismatch. Eppolito was loud, impulsive, and quick to anger. Caracappa was quiet, methodical, and efficient, but somehow they made it work. Maybe it was because they shared something deeper, a familiarity with the world they were supposed to be fighting. Eppolito had grown up surrounded by it. His father and uncles were all members of the Gambino crime family. Caracappa's connection was more circumstantial, but no less real. He lived across the street from Tommy Gotti, the future Gambino underboss. The two stayed in touch for years. He never asked me for anything, but he also knew if he needed a favor, if I could do it, I would. Caracappa would later say. Working side by side in the Brooklyn robbery squad, the two discovered a shared understanding, an unspoken rule that the line between cop and criminal could bend when it suited them. Eppolito had his own way of enforcing order. By his own admission, his partner once had to stop him from beating a suspect to death. The public will never understand the mentality of a cop. A good cop, anyway. In a way, it's very similar to the mentality of organized crime. You do what you have to do and don't think twice about consequences, Eppolito once said. This same twisted, self-serving mindset seemed to have been shared by Caracappa. In 1978, while working undercover in narcotics, he built a case against a dealer named Richard Worm. But when Worm was arrested, Caracappa didn't stop there. He visited Worm's wife, Diane Frisco, who was out on bail, and told her, "You know, I can help your husband when it comes time for a trial. Remember, I'm holding all the aces." According to Diane, he later drove her to a motel near the highway where he assaulted her. Afterward, he told her, "If you say anything, no one's going to believe you." And he was unfortunately right. For nearly 3 decades, both men would use their badges to protect themselves from suspicion and to hide what they really were. On the afternoon of November 4th, 1986, Peter Mitchell, a 29-year-old former Marine, was running along the Belt Parkway in Brooklyn when he saw a gray Oldsmobile pulled to the side of the road. Inside sat an older, heavy-set white man with graying hair, and beside him, a young black woman in a brown fur coat, staring blankly toward Jamaica Bay with what Mitchell described as a dead stare. Mitchell ran on, but when he circled back about 40 minutes later, the same car was parked in a grassy area near a horseback riding school. He watched as the driver got out, walked around, and began pulling something from the passenger side. At first, Mitchell thought it was garbage, until he saw a pair of legs. The man dragged the woman's body to a tree, covered her with a quilt, and scattered beer cans around her. Then he looked up and saw Mitchell watching. Without panic, the man got back in his car and drove off. The victim, they later identified, was Virginia Robertson, a 27-year-old mother who had been strangled. Mitchell, an African American, was uncomfortable with the police because he knew that even an innocent man could get locked away for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But he stayed, called 911, and waited. The first detective on the scene, Richard Kundarazzi, collected the evidence, and took Mitchell's statement. The description he gave matched a local car thief, Stephen Brigant, a man with known Mafia ties. But before Kundarazzi could follow up, Detective Louis Eppolito arrived. Eppolito immediately sent everyone home. When Mitchell pointed out the beer cans near the body, possible fingerprints, Eppolito tossed them in the trash. Mitchell went over the description again, but Eppolito didn't seem interested. Instead, that evening, he drove Mitchell to a nearby housing project, pointed to a man walking out, and said, "That's him." It was a man named Barry Gibbs. Mitchell said, "No, it wasn't," but Eppolito pressed harder. Back at the station, the tone shifted. Eppolito leaned in close, telling Mitchell that Gibbs was a dangerous man who had hurt people before. Mitchell kept insisting it wasn't him. Then Eppolito changed tactics, showing off his medals and commendations before turning to threats. He said he knew where Mitchell's family lived and wondered aloud what might happen if police found drugs in their homes. Then he made it clear, "You're going to do this, or else." After 6 hours of pressure, Peter Mitchell gave in. A few days later, Barry Gibbs, a mailman and Navy veteran who had fallen into addiction, was arrested outside his apartment. "I got thrown against a car, and they tell me to empty out my pockets. I say, 'What's this about?' He throws me in the back of the car, and he says, 'I'm Detective Louis Eppolito.'" Gibbs maintained his innocence. He didn't even ask for a lawyer. "An innocent man has nothing to hide," he said later. "What do I need a lawyer for? I didn't do anything." But at the lineup, Mitchell identified him, and the following year testified against him while Eppolito watched from the back of the courtroom. With no DNA, no fingerprints, or any proof whatsoever, the jury relied fully on that testimony. Barry Gibbs was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years to life. It never became clear what Eppolito's motive was to frame Gibbs for Virginia Robertson's murder. Was it to boost his own reputation? Or to protect a Mafia member, to gain their trust? Whatever his motive was, there was no going back anymore. For Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa, being detectives wasn't enough. They wanted more: money, power, and in a way, the same respect that a man in the Mafia commanded. But to get there, they needed someone on the inside, a partner. So Eppolito turned to his family. His cousin Frank Santoro, a Gambino associate with the right contacts, started asking around for anyone who might need a little help from two well-placed NYPD detectives. Whatever the job was, they could handle it. While serving time in federal prison, Santoro had formed a friendship with Bert Kaplan, a Jewish mobster who operated by the same codes as the Mafia itself. Kaplan was disciplined, business-minded, and loyal to the Lucchese family. When Santoro mentioned his cousin and his partner, Kaplan listened. Santoro said they were willing to do business on the side if the price was right. And if Kaplan had any serious problem, he, his cousin, and his cousin's partner were capable of doing a murder. Kaplan hesitated. He'd been around long enough to know that doing business with a cop, no matter how dirty, was dangerous. Still, the offer stayed in the back of his mind, and not long after, the opportunity to use their services would come. August 2nd, 1985, Israel Greenwald stepped off a flight from London and into the hands of the FBI. Greenwald, a 35-year-old diamond dealer from Queens, had unknowingly cashed 2 stolen U.S. Treasury bills for a man named Herman Tabak who was secretly working in partnership with Bert Kaplan. So when Israel Greenwald presented his passport at the airport, agents pulled him aside. He told investigators he didn't know the bills were stolen. Agent Beverly Bartzer believed he might be telling the truth. She asked him to stay in contact. Days later, Herman Tabak showed up at Greenwald's house, warning him not to talk to anyone, or he would be sorry. Agent Bartzer urged Greenwald to cooperate. He agreed to wear a recorder for a follow-up meeting with Tabak, but the plan fell apart when Tabak discovered the device. The FBI decided to pause the case and let things die down. Months passed. In February 1986, Bartzer called Greenwald's attorney to restart the operation. 6 days later, the lawyer called back. Greenwald was missing. Behind the scenes, Tabak had already warned Bert Kaplan that Greenwald might be talking to the police. Kaplan reached out to his old prison friend, Frank Santoro. Within days, detectives Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa had pulled Greenwald's address, car model, and license plate number. February 10th, 1986. As Greenwald was driving home, the two detectives appeared behind him with flashing lights. They told him he was wanted in connection with a hit and run and needed to come in for a lineup. He got into their car without hesitation. But they never took him to the station. That same afternoon, they met Santoro at an auto repair lot on Nostrand Avenue, owned by a man named Peter Franzone. Franzone had worked on Santoro's car before. He knew better than to ask questions. But when Santoro and the detectives walked into the garage with a man wearing a yarmulke and later came out without him, Franzone understood exactly what was happening. Santoro came to the small shed Franzone used as an office and told him to come with him. Inside the garage, Franzone saw a man slumped against the wall. Santoro then opened his trunk, took out 2 shovels, and told Franzone to dig. Frankie told me that I got to help bury the body because I'm an accessory with it. And if I didn't help him, if I go and tell anybody, that he would kill me and my family, Peter Franzone later said. Franzone dug a 5-foot hole into the dirt floor. They placed Greenwald's body inside, poured lime over it, and sealed the grave with concrete. That night, Greenwald's wife Leah waited for him to return home. When he didn't, she called the police. The FBI later found his car abandoned in long-term parking at JFK Airport and assumed he'd run. But Leah refused to believe it. For the next 20 years, she and her 2 daughters lived without answers. No body, no evidence, no closure. The murder of Israel Greenwald was a test run. Proof that Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa would really be up for the job. For Bert Kaplan, and by extension the Lucchese family, the detectives were a new kind of weapon. The Mafia already had hitmen, but these 2 had badges. Later, when Anthony Casso was looking to enact his revenge after the failed attempt on his life outside the Golden Ox restaurant, he turned to Bert Kaplan, who offered his 2 new murder cops for hire. At this point, Kaplan did not know their names. His friend Frank Santoro worked directly with them, and Kaplan preferred it that way. The less he knew, the safer everyone was if someday somebody flipped. Eppolito and Caracappa had easy access to the police file on the Golden Ox shooting. Inside was a report naming the suspects and their addresses. Jimmy Heidel wasn't hard to find. He was already a person of interest in another case, the disappearance of his girlfriend, Annette DiBiase. On the morning of October 18, 1986, the 2 detectives were already posted outside Jimmy Heidel's house, When they saw a man leave and drive away, they followed closely, then pulled up, flashed their badges, and tried to grab him, only to realize they'd made a mistake. It wasn't Jimmy Heidel, it was Frankie, his younger brother. Shaken, Frankie rushed back home and told his mother, Betty, what had happened. Not long after, Betty got into her own car and intercepted the two detectives as they circled the block. When she came face to face with them, she rolled down her window and asked who they were. Eppolito then flashed his badge and told her it was police business. Later that same day, the detectives found Jimmy Heidel near Bay 8th Street. Flashing their badges, they handcuffed him and told him he was wanted for questioning. Heidel, probably thinking this was an official police inquiry about his missing girlfriend, was cooperative. But as the drive went on, he eventually realized they weren't heading toward a precinct. Instead, they took him to the same garage on Nostrand Avenue where they had taken Israel Greenwald months before. Inside waited Frank Santoro. The three men tied Jimmy's hands and feet and put him into the trunk of Santoro's car to be transported to a meeting with Casso. Jimmy Heidel was never seen again. But this wasn't the end of Casso's revenge. Two more names remained on his list, Nicky Guido and Bob Bering. According to Bert Kaplan, when Casso asked for Guido's address, Detective Eppolito demanded an extra $4,000. Casso found that greedy, and he refused. So the detectives eventually gave him the address. Christmas Day. 26-year-old Nicky Guido stepped out to show his uncle his new car. As they sat side by side in the vehicle, Nicky was pointing out the dashboard controls when two men approached, raised their guns, and fired through the windshield. Nicky Guido threw himself over his uncle, shielding him, and died seconds later. The thing is, he wasn't the Nicky Guido the hitman had been sent to kill. There were two men named Nicholas Guido. They were 3 years apart, living in nearby Brooklyn neighborhoods. Eppolito and Caracappa, the good cops they were, gave Casso the wrong address and caused the death of a completely innocent young man. Nicky Guido's mother kept his room untouched until her own death, blaming herself for naming him in the Italian tradition after her father. When asked about the murder years later, Casso shrugged. Hey, it's a mistake. No big deal. But Casso wasn't done. He wanted the other surviving shooter, Bob Bering. But before he could find him, the FBI did. Agents recovered a receipt signed by Bering for dropping off a red and white Thunderbird, the same car used in the abduction of Jimmy Heidel's missing girlfriend, Annette DiBiase. Faced with the evidence, Bob Bering flipped. He led the detectives to a makeshift grave where he and Heidel had buried Annette DiBiase's body and agreed to wear a wire. Through him, the FBI found the real Nicky Guido alive, hiding in Florida, and brought him in. Just like Bering, he flipped. It seemed both men preferred prison over what awaited them if Casso found them first. Then, in September 1987, Frank Santoro, Eppolito's cousin, and the detective's only direct link to the mob, was gunned down in Brooklyn. He wasn't the target. The bullets were meant for his friend, a Lucchese member. But Santoro was hit twice in the torso and died within the hour. For Eppolito, the loss was personal and financial. Their connection to Casso was gone. Until then, neither Casso nor Kaplan had even known the detectives' names. That changed a few weeks later when Santoro's widow invited Kaplan over. Inside her home sat Louis Eppolito. Kaplan later recalled their conversation. Louis says, "I'm pretty sure you know who I am." I said, "Yes, I know who you are. You're Frankie's cousin. Louis asked me if I had a desire to continue the business that we were doing together. The offer was simple. For today's equivalent of $11,000 a month, the detectives would give Casso everything. Intel on wiretaps, raids, informants, arrests, murder contracts would cost extra. Kaplan took the proposal to Casso, and he agreed, just as long as they worked exclusively for him. Now officially on Anthony Casso's payroll, the detectives resumed their work. During this period, their information was used to carry out the attempted murder of Dominic Costa and the killings of John Otto Heidel, Victor Folico, Bruno Facciolo, and Anthony DeLappy. 2 weeks after DeLappy's murder, Luis Eppolito hosted a lavish retirement party at El Caribe, the Brooklyn banquet hall famous for its mob clientele. 2 years later, after more informants turned up dead and Stephen Caracappa successfully warned Casso to go into hiding, he followed Eppolito, retiring from the force as well. However, for Eppolito, this wasn't the end. His retirement meant reinvention. He started picking up small acting gigs, a hitman on the television show Kojak, even a cameo in Goodfellas, where he played a background mobster named Fat Andy. Eppolito later said he met the actor Joe Pesci on the Goodfellas set, and that Pesci helped him land small parts in Predator 2, Bullets Over Broadway, and Lost Highway. Leaning fully into his image as the ex-cop with Mafia blood, Eppolito decided to tell his own story, or rather, his version of it. In 1992, he published a memoir co-written with journalist Bob Drury, Mafia Cop, the story of an honest cop whose family was the mob. The book painted him as a misunderstood hero, a good cop, framed by jealous colleagues, haunted by his father's criminal legacy. To most readers, it was self-serving fiction, and to anyone who knew the truth, it was also reckless. Former underboss of the Gambino family, Sammy Gravano, told reporters he put a light on himself. I thought at the time it was weird. You can't do that kind of stuff. Bragging like that, whether you're a cop or a gangster. I thought to myself, these cops aren't going to like what you did. His partner, Caracappa, saw the danger immediately. The memoir included a photo of the two partners smiling in their squad room, captioned, "Two Godfathers of the NYPD." Still, Louis was proud. He promoted the book on the Sally Jesse Raphael show. He told tear-filled stories about his abusive father and claimed to have taken justice into his own hands against mobsters. The studio audience applauded him as a rogue hero. But there was one audience member who seemed to know something that the rest of the people in that room didn't. Lou, we reap what we sow in this life. How do you think your life's going to end? Well, I'm going to make it end good. There's nobody in the world that can defeat me and my inner self. I'm very happy and very strong-minded. I could never bow to people. Do you have a conscience of what you've been doing? I mean, do you ever lose sleep at night? Oh no, not at all. I did my job as best I could. And, take a break. We'll be right back. After the book's release, Louis Eppolito and his wife Fran left Brooklyn for Las Vegas. Their new home, a sun-bathed villa with a pool, a collection of guns, and a few pet snakes. Directly across from them lived Stephen Caracappa and his wife. Caracappa worked security at a women's prison. Eppolito chased movie roles and attention. Together, they convinced themselves their past was buried, that their crystal ball years were behind them. But they soon found out time had only postponed their day of judgment, March 26, 1994. The front page of the New York Daily News delivered a bombshell. The headline read, "Hero Cops or Hitmen." Reporter Jerry Capesi had published what sounded unthinkable. Anthony Gaspar, the feared Lucchese underboss, had named 2 NYPD detectives as his accomplices. The article featured the photo from Eppolito's book, Mafia Cop. For anyone who knew Eppolito, the idea that he might be a crooked cop wasn't shocking. But working directly for Anthony Gaspar, one of the most violent men in New York's underworld, that was something else entirely. And as for Stephen Caracappa, the quiet administrator of the major case squad, nobody could have imagined him capable of such brutality. August 8, 1997. Prosecutor George Stamboulidis sent a letter to Casso's lawyer. Casso had broken every promise he'd made in his deal with the prosecution. He bribed guards, attacked another inmate, attempted to undermine the credibility of fellow witnesses like Sammy Gravano and Al Darko. The Justice Department officially cut him off, refusing to reduce his sentence or offer protection. Casso became the first mob turncoat ever expelled from the witness program. 9 days later, he was sentenced to 13 life terms, more than 4 centuries behind bars. He was sent to Administrative Maximum Facility near Florence, Colorado, a prison built for the most dangerous men alive. Casso said, "I helped them, and I get life without parole." This is really a joke. For most of the world, it wasn't. His downfall was a relief, one less informant to worry about. But for 2 retired detectives living quietly in Las Vegas, it was something more, a gift. Without Casso's testimony, the case against Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa vanished. Their murders, kidnappings, and betrayals would stay buried, or so it seemed. On the morning of September 9th, 1996, federal agents knocked on the door of Bert Kaplan's brick home in Bensonhurst. When his wife opened the door, they found Kaplan in bed. Moments later, he was in handcuffs. Kaplan and an associate were charged with moving 24 tons of marijuana and 44 pounds of cocaine, along with tax fraud. In custody, agents pushed him to talk, to give up what he knew about the 2 retired NYPD detectives. Kaplan refused. At trial, witnesses detailed his smuggling empire. Even his family urged him to make a deal, but he wouldn't. The jury found him guilty, and at 62, he was sentenced to 27 years. Effectively, life. His lawyer called him the last true believer in the code of the Mafia, the Omerta. Unlike the bosses who'd previously folded under pressure, Kaplan stayed silent, and with Casso discredited and Kaplan locked away, the FBI's case against Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa went cold yet again. For years, the files sat untouched, and they might have stayed that way if not for a small-time Gambino associate named Frankie Heidel and one determined detective, Tommy Dades. Frankie Heidel did jobs like any other associate: robbery, extortion, petty deals. But after a murder gone wrong and a parole violation, he agreed to cooperate with law enforcement. That's how he met Detective Tommy Dades. At first, Frankie didn't like Detective Dades, but over time, the hostility turned into trust. He told Dades and his FBI partner Matt Tromey small but valuable pieces of information. However, word soon got out that he was an informant. In early 1998, whispers spread through Staten Island that Frankie was leaking information. Detective Dades urged him to get off the street, to enter witness protection. Frankie refused. He thought his friends were just testing his loyalty. He didn't believe they would actually kill him. Days later, on April 27th, he was lured to a strip club called Scarlet. When he stepped into the parking lot after midnight, someone shot him 3 times. Frankie Heidel died. Detective Dades and his FBI partner Matt Tromey took the news hard. To them, Frankie wasn't just another informant. He was someone they'd come to care about. They drove to his mother's house to break the news. Betty Heidel was devastated. Dades promised they'd find whoever killed her son. Over time, the two formed an unlikely friendship. Betty would call Detective Dades now and then, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to vent about how the NYPD had failed her. But in one of those calls, years later, she said something that stopped Dades cold. It was September 2003. The conversation drifted, as it often did, to her older son, Jimmy Heidel, the one who disappeared back in 1986 after trying to kill Gaspipe Casso. Then, almost as an afterthought, Betty said she knew who had taken him. On the day Jimmy vanished, 2 plainclothes detectives came to her door, a fat one and a thin one, as she described. And apparently, years later, she saw the fat one on the Sally Jesse Raphael show promoting his book, Mafia Cop. So she bought the book and learned their names were Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa. That revelation sent Dades digging through 10 boxes of evidence that had sat untouched for years. He started connecting the dots no one else had. For example, Caracappa had taken a day off the very day diamond dealer Israel Greenwald vanished. He'd also made notes about Lucchese turncoat Anthony Delapi just before the man was executed in Los Angeles. But the real breakthrough came from a digital breadcrumb. Dades found that on November 11th, 1986, Caracappa had run a search for Nicky Guido. 44 days later, that innocent Nicky Guido was dead. It was the first hard proof that Casso had been telling the truth all along. However, Betty Heidel's testimony wasn't enough to bring down 2 former NYPD detectives. Prosecutors needed something more. Someone from the inside who could tie everything together. After 9 years behind bars, Bert Kaplan, the once loyal mob associate, was old, sick, and out of options. For nearly a decade, he'd refused every deal offered to him. But when investigators pressed again in 2004, Kaplan hesitated. He'd spent too long protecting men who probably wouldn't do the same for him. Deep down, he was afraid that if he didn't flip, Eppolito and Caracappa eventually would. And when they did, they'd point the finger at him. So Kaplan decided to do it first. With his cooperation, prosecutors finally had what they'd been missing for nearly 20 years. A credible insider who could prove that 2 NYPD detectives had secretly been working for the Mafia. But by 2005, the case that Tommy Dades and the Brooklyn DA had spent years building was suddenly out of their hands. Federal prosecutors in the Eastern District had quietly moved forward, convening their own grand jury and preparing racketeering-influenced and corrupt organization act charges against Eppolito and Caracappa without telling the Brooklyn team. The reason was simple. The clock was running out. The murders were old. But the FBI had a fresh crime to reset the statute of limitations. An informant posing as a crooked accountant had recorded the retired detectives agreeing to launder drug money. It even helped orchestrate a staged meth sale involving Eppolito's own son. It was the final piece of evidence the feds needed to prove the Mafia cops were still active. The Brooklyn DA was furious, but powerless. Bert Kaplan was now a federal witness, and without him, their case couldn't stand. In the end, the DA agreed to let the FBI take it all. The entire story, from Jimmy Heidel's murder to the detective's final downfall, would be told in one sweeping RICO case. March 9th, 2005. Nearly 20 years after they started working for Caso, Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa were out for dinner in Las Vegas when agents closed in. Caracappa raised his hands without protest. Eppolito resisted before being forced to the ground. Agent Kenny Luzik told him, "It's been a long time coming." Eppolito replied, "Yes, it has." Hours later, agents raided Eppolito's home. They found 116 firearms, assault rifles, a sawed-off shotgun, a revolver, engraved Mafia cop Louis Eppolito, and pictures documenting Eppolito's ties with mobsters. His son, Anthony, was arrested alongside a family friend for the meth deal that had finally given prosecutors their RICO hook. The next day, the indictment was unsealed in Brooklyn. It accused the two of 8 murders, 2 attempted murders, kidnapping, money laundering, compromising state and federal investigations, and leaking the names of informants, 3 of whom were later killed. The Justice Department called it the most shocking case of police corruption in New York history. That night, Detective Tommy Dades called Betty Heidel. After 2 decades of waiting, she finally heard the words she never thought she would. They'd been caught. It was like a weight off her shoulders, Detective Dades said. Across the county, Nikki Guido's mother saw the news. She didn't grasp the situation until her surviving son, Mike Guido, called her. "We never thought 18 years later this would turn up. We had left it alone." And for one man, the arrests meant freedom. Barry Gibbs, the postal worker framed for murder by Detective Eppolito, had spent 19 years in prison. When agents searched Eppolito's house, they found the original homicide file he'd taken when he retired. It was all the Innocence Project needed to reopen the case. Peter Mitchell, the original key witness, recanted, admitting he'd lied after being threatened by Eppolito. September 29th, 2005. Barry Gibbs walked out of court a free man. A year later, in an interview with the TV show 60 Minutes, Barry expressed his anger. "He's a corrupt cop, and he's no good. And that's the end of it. He ruined my life. He could have done that to anybody. It just so happened it was me. He could have done it to you. He could have done it to anybody sitting here." But the revelations didn't end there. Investigators turned to one last name tied to their files: the missing diamond dealer, Israel Greenwald. Acting on information from Bert Kaplan, they found Peter Franzone. He couldn't remember which garage contained Greenwald's body. So on March 23rd, 2005, the FBI team simply picked one at random and started working. For 2 days, the FBI dug through concrete and soil, and on the 3rd, they found him. Greenwald had been shot twice in the back of the head and buried in the same clothes he'd been wearing on the day he disappeared. Greenwald's family finally got closure. 2 months later, they buried him in Tel Aviv under a white stone engraved in Hebrew. A charitable and kind man, big-hearted, a good friend, killed by the hands of evil people in New York on February 10th, 1986, when he was only 34. In January 2006, just 2 months before the trial, 60 Minutes aired an interview with Stephen Caracappa. When asked how he responded to accusations that he was a mafia hitman, Caracappa dismissed them outright. "How do you respond to that? Totally ridiculous. It's ludicrous." Anybody that knows me knows I love the police department. I couldn't kill anybody. I shot a guy once on a job, and I still think about it. Bothers me. When journalist Ed Bradley pressed him further, asking if he would have committed the crimes had he known he wouldn't be caught, Caracappa replied, "Get caught. Everybody gets caught. The person who did this is going to get caught." And he was right. He and Eppolito did get caught. March 6th, 2009. Judge Jack Weinstein handed down the final sentences. Louis Eppolito was sentenced to life in prison plus 100 years with a $4.75 million fine. Stephen Caracappa received life in prison plus 80 years and a $4.25 million fine. After nearly 2 decades of investigation, betrayal, and courtroom battles, the long, twisted saga of the Mafia cops was finally over. Justice had caught up to them. After sentencing, Luis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa were sent to high-security penitentiaries. Eppolito to Tucson, Arizona. Caracappa to Butner, North Carolina. Barry Gibbs, the wrongfully convicted postal worker, won a $9.9 million settlement from New York City, the largest individual payout in city history at the time. He spent his final years free but ill, saying he would live each day like it's my last. He died of colon cancer in 2018. Meanwhile, the families of the detectives' murder victims sued New York City for failing to stop the corruption. After years of delays and appeals, the city paid a total of $18.4 million to settle with 7 families, including $5 million each to the relatives of Nikki Guido and Israel Greenwald. In 2016, Stephen Caracappa, terminally ill with cancer, petitioned Judge Weinstein for early release. The judge refused. Caracappa died behind bars the following year, age 75. Luis Eppolito outlived his partner by 2 years. He died in 2019, age 71, in a hospital near Tucson Penitentiary. Their former benefactor, Anthony Gaspipe Casso, remained in prison for more than 2 decades. He suffered from multiple illnesses and contracted COVID-19 in late 2020. He died from complications of the virus on December 15, 2020. It's unsettling to consider how differently things might have unfolded if Luis Eppolito hadn't chased the spotlight by publishing his book, Mafia Cop. Anthony Casso may never have been able to rat out his crystal ball, and if he hadn't sat under the studio lights of the Sally Jessy Raphael show, Betty Heidel might never have been able to tell police who took her son. 2 decisions, driven by the crippling weight of his ego, set off a chain reaction that exposed everything. If you made it this far, thank you. If you found this story important, do me one more favor. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss the next investigation. And hit like so more people can find this story. Now, let's turn to a case where ordinary people on the internet became heroes. A case where a Reddit user with no home solved what professional investigators couldn't. On Saturday, December 13th, 2025, the Brown University campus was in the middle of finals week. The temperature had dropped to the mid-30s Fahrenheit. Chilly, but not unusual for a New England December. Inside the Baruch and Holly building, a sprawling complex that houses Brown's engineering and physics departments, students came and went throughout the day. The building's exterior doors were unlocked, as they typically were during daytime hours. Anyone could walk in. No ID, no security screening required, but someone had been watching the building for weeks, and it hadn't gone unnoticed. A custodian had noticed an unusual person on campus multiple times over the weeks, much older than a student, but not a professor or staff member. The custodian saw the strange man pacing the hallways in the Bruce and Holly building, looking into classrooms, even ducking behind a bathroom to avoid being seen. But unfortunately, the custodian didn't find it unusual enough to report. Around 2 p.m. on December 13th, students began arriving for the economics review session in room 166, a large 186-seat auditorium-style classroom on the ground floor. The session was optional, led by a 21-year-old teaching assistant who wanted to help students prepare for their upcoming final. Economics 10100. Principles of Economics, one of Brown's most popular courses. At approximately 4:03 p.m., as the review session was winding down, the teaching assistant and several students sitting near the entrance looked up as the door to room 166 opened, expecting another late arrival, someone rushing in with a last-minute question. But it was not a student. He was stocky, about 5'8", perhaps 200 pounds. He wore all black, black pants, black jacket, black shoes, and a black medical face mask that concealed most of his features. On his head, he wore a black knit cap pulled low over his forehead. In his right hand, he carried a small black satchel. In his left, a 9mm handgun. As the gunman entered the room, he raised his weapon and opened fire without hesitation. He moved through the classroom, firing round after round. The students dove under desks, ran for exits. Some were frozen in terror. Others were hit before they could react. 2 students were killed. One of them was not even enrolled in the course. He simply came to help a friend prepare for the exam. 9 other students were wounded. The teaching assistant, miraculously, was unharmed. But the psychological damage to everyone in that room would last forever. The entire attack lasted less than 90 seconds. When the gunman's last magazine was empty, he calmly turned and walked out of room 166, exiting through the same door he had entered. He moved through a section of the building with limited surveillance coverage toward the Hope Street exit. And then he was gone. Almost as soon as the shots had been fired, students immediately started posting reactions to the shooting on SideChat, an anonymous social media platform for college students, warning others of an active shooter. 4:22 p.m., 19 minutes after the first shot was fired, Brown University's Public Safety and Emergency Management issued an alert to the campus community. Active shooter near Bruce and Holly Engineering. Run, hide, fight, shelter in place. Providence Police, Rhode Island State Police, FBI agents, and tactical teams descended on Brown's campus within minutes. Helicopters circled overhead. SWAT teams swept through buildings. Officers went door to door, clearing classrooms and dorms, searching for any sign of the gunman. But the killer had vanished. Inside the Bruce and Holly building, he left behind an unimaginable scene of chaos and carnage. Pools of blood and shell casings littered the floor of room 166. At least 44 rounds of 9mm ammunition had been fired. The students who had survived hid in locked bathrooms and barricaded offices, terrified the shooter would return. Outside, thousands of students were evacuated from campus buildings, many of them taken to the Olney Margolis Athletic Center. They waited for hours, sending desperate messages to friends and family. Some had fled their dorms without shoes, coats, or even phones, leaving their loved ones in the crippling position of not knowing if they were alive or dead. But while students were sheltering in terror, investigators were facing their own nightmare. They had almost nothing to go on. The students confirmed that the shooter had been wearing a mask and a hat to conceal any identifying features. When authorities checked the cameras, they discovered he had moved through parts of the building with limited camera coverage. Brown University had over 1,200 security cameras installed across campus, yet not a single one of them had captured a clear image of the gunman's face. The cameras did, however, show the chaos after the shooting. The students running, the police response, the frantic evacuation. But they didn't show the shooter entering the building or leaving. The only footage they had was grainy, distant, and frustratingly unclear. The campus remained on lockdown throughout the night. Students on campus were too afraid to sleep, and a bride and groom at a nearby wedding venue were forced to shelter in place during what should have been the happiest day of their lives. The entire East Side neighborhood was paralyzed with fear of a potential round two. Investigators worked through the night, reviewing every second of surveillance footage they could find. They canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking residents if they'd seen anything suspicious. They collected witness statements from students who'd been in the building. They processed the crime scene, collecting the shell casings, examining ballistic evidence, searching for any clue that might lead them to the killer. None of it helped. The shooter had been meticulous. He left no identification or personal items behind, just 44 spent shell casings in a classroom of victims. By Sunday morning, the reality was clear. Whoever did this had planned it carefully, and he was still out there, possibly planning his next attack. Approximately 3:45 a.m. on Sunday, December 14th, less than 12 hours after the shooting. Providence police received a tip. Investigators descended on a Hampton Inn in Coventry, Rhode Island, about 20 miles from Providence, detaining a man they described as a person of interest. Providence Police Chief Oscar Perez announced that they were no longer looking for anyone else in connection with the shooting. Within 2 hours, Brown University finally lifted the shelter-in-place order, allowing those on campus to finally breathe. For a few hours, it seemed like the case might be solved, but by late Sunday night, the hope evaporated. The man detained at the Hampton Inn was released without charges. They got the wrong guy. Rhode Island Attorney General Peter Naranjo held a press conference admitting that while some evidence had pointed to the initial person of interest, the investigation now points in a different direction. Chief Perez defended the detention, saying it was not a mistake, but just how investigations work. That wasn't how everybody felt. Multiple law enforcement sources told reporters that actually, it was a mistake. They claimed that the investigation had to effectively restart after early missteps, and that the process had been set back by several hours. Every hour in an investigation like this is precious. Hours when the real shooter was getting further away, covering his tracks, possibly even fleeing the state. To the terrified public, it signaled the most worrying sign of all. Law enforcement had no idea who they were looking for. By the next day, investigators were back to square one. They released new images and video of a person of interest, a stocky man in dark clothing and a face mask walking through Providence's streets. Exactly the same as the description given to them by the students. But the footage was blurry, distant, maddeningly vague. The man's face was completely obscured. His features were indistinguishable. The FBI announced a reward of up to $50,000 for information leading to the identification, arrest, and conviction of the shooter. They pleaded with the public for help. "We're looking for a moment that is shorter than someone taking a breath," Chief Perez said, urging anyone with camera footage from the area to come forward. The investigators were soon flooded with tips from people who thought they recognized the man in the video. But the tips that came in were largely unhelpful. Others reported seeing suspicious people near campus. But none of those leads panned out either. Approximately 8:30 p.m. on Monday, December 15th, 2 days after the shooting, the situation escalated. In Brookline, Massachusetts, a quiet suburb just outside Boston, about 50 miles from Providence, police got an unexpected call. Shots had been fired on Gibbs Street in a residential building near Boston University. When officers arrived, they found 47-year-old Nuno Fernandez Gonçalves Loureiro lying in the foyer of his apartment building, suffering from multiple gunshot wounds. Paramedics rushed him to Beth Israel Hospital, where he underwent emergency surgery. But it was too late to save him. Loureiro was pronounced dead early Tuesday morning, December 16th. Investigators working the Brown shooting case couldn't shake the question: were these cases related, or just two tragic coincidences? Nuno Loureiro was an acclaimed physicist, a professor of nuclear science and engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and the director of MIT's Plasma Science and Fusion Center. He was a graduate of the Instituto Superior Técnico in Lisbon, Portugal, an incredibly accomplished scientist, not a student, like the killings at Brown University. The FBI publicly stated that there was no known connection between the Brown shooting and the MIT professor's murder. It was just a terrible coincidence. Two horrific crimes in the same region within 48 hours. But that wasn't the whole truth. Behind the scenes, investigators were starting to notice troubling similarities between the cases. Both shootings were execution style. The victims of both shootings were connected to academia, and both crimes had been carried out with a high level of precision, with no obvious evidence left behind to track the killer. However, without concrete evidence linking the two cases, law enforcement treated them as separate investigations. The Brookline police launched a homicide inquiry into the murder of Loureiro, but they publicly maintained that the cases were unrelated. None of this settled the anxiety, especially for investigators. A college campus shooter was still at large, and a renowned MIT professor had been murdered. And law enforcement seemed no closer to solving either case. But that's because they simply hadn't been looking in the right place. On the same night Nuno Loureiro was murdered, an anonymous Reddit user logged onto the R Providence subreddit and posted a comment in a thread about the Brown shooting. "I'm being dead serious. The police need to look into the gray Nissan with Florida plates, possibly a rental. That was the car he was driving. Under normal circumstances, a post like this might have been ignored." Reddit is full of amateur sleuths and armchair detectives, especially during high-profile crimes. After the disastrous false accusations during the Boston Marathon bombing investigation in 2013, when Reddit users wrongly identified an innocent student as a suspect, the platform had become increasingly cautious about vigilante justice. But this one felt different. It wasn't vague or speculative. The Redditor wasn't even suggesting specific people. He didn't say, "I think," or "maybe." He said, "Police need to look into this." Other Reddit users urged the Redditor to report the information to the FBI. One user wrote, "If you really saw this, you need to call the tip line now." The Redditor replied, "I already did." By this point, investigators had received hundreds of tips, nearly 200 of them considered actionable. The Redditor's tip was just one of many, and as a result, it was lost in the pile. But the next day, someone at the Providence Police Department saw the Redditor's comment. One detail immediately caught their attention: a gray Nissan with Florida plates, possibly a rental. Up until that moment, investigators had not connected any vehicle to the shooter. They had surveillance footage of a masked man walking through Providence's streets, but they didn't know how he arrived or how he left. And if he had driven a car, they certainly didn't know what kind it was. The Redditor's tip may have done exactly what the authorities were struggling to do: identify a tangible piece of evidence that they could actually trace. If it was legitimate, that is. Investigators began combing through their surveillance footage, this time specifically looking for a gray Nissan sedan. They found one, captured on multiple cameras throughout the day on December 13th, moving through the streets near Brown's campus. The next step was to identify the license plate and track exactly where this person of interest had been in the days leading up to the attack. Providence police had access to a network of more than 70 automated license plate readers operated around the city by a surveillance company called Flock Safety. These solar-powered cameras, mounted on poles throughout the city, capture images and data from passing vehicles, including license plates. They're controversial due to privacy concerns, but in this case, they were useful. Using Flock's database, investigators found multiple hits on a gray Nissan Sentra sedan with license plate 62DQEV from Florida, just like the Redditor had claimed. In the area around Brown's campus on and leading up to December 13th, Flock cameras captured the Nissan 14 different times in the Providence area on December 1st, 12th, and again on the 13th, the day of the attack. Most telling of all, that day the vehicle had been circling the neighborhood for hours before the shooting took place. With the license plate in hand, investigators traced the vehicle to the rental car company, Alamo Rental Car, in downtown Boston. The car had been rented out on December 1st, nearly 2 weeks before the shooting. Detectives obtained security footage from the Alamo facility, and there, finally, they had what they desperately needed: a clear image of the renter's face. His name was on the rental agreement: Claudio Manuel Neves Valente, a 48-year-old Portuguese national. But before investigators could move forward, they needed to talk to the Redditor who had led them to this suspect in the first place. The problem was, they still had no idea who he was. They knew he had posted on Reddit and that he had called the FBI tip line, but they didn't have his name, his address, or his contact information. However, their investigation did lead them to a second person of interest who would break open the entire case. Investigators released security footage capturing this individual having some kind of confrontation with the prime suspect near the corner of Cook and Benevolent Streets just 2 hours before the attack. They desperately wanted to speak to this individual. That man, it turns out, was a homeless man and former Brown student who now often sleeps in the basement of the Bruce and Holly building. Wednesday, December 17th. After seeing himself in the surveillance footage, the homeless student approached Providence police officers near Brown's University Alumni Hall. He told them he wanted to talk. He had information about the shooter. Officers immediately brought him to the police station for an interview and were surprised to discover that this homeless former student was also the Redditor who had drawn attention to the gray Nissan. Investigators have since referred to this man as John. So we'll do the same. What John told them was extraordinary. According to the affidavit, John's encounter with the shooter began at approximately 1:45 p.m. on Saturday, December 13th. More than 2 hours before the attack, John had been inside the Baruch and Holly building using a ground floor restroom across from the auditorium where the shooting would later occur. While in the restroom, John noticed another man inside wearing a surgical mask and dark clothing. John made eye contact with him, and immediately something felt wrong. His clothing was inappropriate and inadequate for the weather. John told investigators it was December in New England. The temperature was in the 30s, yet this man was dressed as if he were trying to hide, not stay warm. John left the restroom, and soon after, so did the masked man. And then, as John later described it, a game of cat and mouse began. John followed the man outside, keeping his distance, watching him move through the residential streets around Brown's campus. The man walked to a gray Nissan sedan with Florida plates parked behind the Rhode Island Historical Society, just 3 blocks from the Baruch and Holly building. The man approached the car, unlocked it, looked inside, then locked it again, and walked away. John thought this was strange. Why would someone unlock their car, not get in or grab anything from it, then lock it again and keep walking? When John approached the car and peeked in the window, he noticed 2 funny-style bags on the rear floorboard on the passenger side. The man circled the block. John kept following. Every time they made eye contact, the man changed direction as if trying to lose or evade him. It all made John more suspicious. At one point, John called out to him, "Your car is back there. Why are you circling the block?" The man turned around. He stared at John, and then he responded, "I don't know you from nobody." Then repeatedly asked, "Why are you harassing me?" John decided to back off. He watched the man approach the Nissan one more time, then walk away again. John stopped following him. After that, a little over 2 hours later, the shooting occurred. When John saw the surveillance images released by police, he immediately recognized the man. He went straight to Reddit and called the FBI tip line. During the police interview, detectives showed John 2 surveillance images of the suspect's vehicle. John exclaimed, "Holy, that could be it." They showed him footage from the Alamo rental car facility, including images of the man who rented the car. John recognized him as the same man he had encountered in the bathroom. Attorney General Peter Noronha would later say, "He blew this case right open. When you crack it, you crack it." With John's testimony and the rental car records in hand, investigators now had a name to chase: Claudio Manuel Neves Valente. They ran his background, but what they found was both unexpected and deeply troubling. Neves Valente had a direct connection to Brown University. He had been enrolled as a graduate student in the physics PhD program from the fall of 2000 to the spring of 2001. He had taken a leave of absence in April 2001 and formally withdrew in July 2003, never completing his degree. He had no active affiliation with Brown for more than 2 decades. But there was more. Neves Valente had also attended the Instituto Superior Técnico in Lisbon, Portugal, between 1995 and 2000, studying for a degree in engineering physics. He graduated with a remarkable average score of 19 out of 20, an extraordinary achievement at one of Portugal's most demanding universities. That means he was at the university at the same time as Nuno Loureiro, the MIT professor who was murdered. Investigators had just stumbled onto the connection that linked the Brown shooting to the MIT professor's murder. They were classmates. They knew each other. Former classmates told investigators that Neves Valente had been brilliant but difficult. He frequently got into conflicts with fellow students, believing they were all incompetent compared to him. After leaving Brown, Neves Valente's academic career collapsed. A 1998 announcement in Portugal's official Diário da República referred to Neves Valente's appointment as a teaching assistant at IST. But then, a 2000 notice mentioned his termination from the role. Reporters later indicated that he had been dismissed from the position for unknown reasons. In 2017, Neves Valente won a U.S. green card through the Diversity Visa Lottery program, becoming a lawful permanent resident. He returned to the United States, and then, for reasons still unknown, he severed ties with his family in Portugal. 8 years later, in November 2025, Neves Valente was preparing for his attack. He rented a storage unit in Salem, New Hampshire on November 25th. He rented a hotel room in Boston on November 29th and 30th. And on December 1st, he rented a gray Nissan Sentra with Florida plates from Alamo in downtown Boston. For nearly 2 weeks, he circled Brown's campus, watching, planning, preparing. Security camera footage captured him on campus as early as November 28th. December 13th, he walked into room 166 and opened fire. After fleeing Rhode Island, Neves Valente drove to Brookline, Massachusetts. Security footage captured him within a half-mile of MIT professor Nuno Loureiro's home and entering an apartment building in the vicinity on December 15th, around 8:30 p.m., the night Loureiro was fatally shot. About an hour later, he was seen entering the Salem, New Hampshire storage facility, where he had rented a unit. Now, on Thursday, December 18th, 5 days after the Brown shooting, investigators had identified their suspect. They had his name, his photo, and clear connections tying him to both murders. They had traced his movements through surveillance footage and license plate readers. But Neves Valente had been meticulous. After fleeing Rhode Island, he had swapped the Florida license plate on his rental car for Maine plates, attempting to evade detection. Approximately 9 p.m. on Thursday, December 18th, FBI SWAT teams executed court-authorized search warrants at the Salem storage facility. They found Neves Valente's body inside an empty unit next to the one he had rented. An autopsy conducted by the New Hampshire Medical Examiner's Office determined that Neves Valente had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound on Tuesday, December 16th, the same day Nuno Loureiro succumbed to his injuries at the hospital. By the time investigators found the shooter, he had been dead for 2 days. Investigators also found his satchel containing 2 firearms and an electronic device containing 4 short video recordings. At a late-night press conference on Thursday, December 18th, Rhode Island Attorney General Peter Noronha and U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts Lee Foley announced their findings. The Connecticut State Police Forensic Science Laboratory had confirmed, through DNA analysis and ballistics testing, that one of the guns was involved in the mass shooting at Brown University, while the other was connected to Lorero's death. The shell casings from the two crime scenes did not match, confirming that two different weapons were used. A preliminary DNA test established a match between Neves Valente and DNA obtained from evidence at Brown University. They confirmed he acted alone, but acknowledged that many questions remain unanswered. Why did he target Brown? Why that particular classroom? Why Nuno Loureiro? And what was his motive? The manhunt was over, but the mystery of why it happened was far from solved. Over the holidays, as Brown students scattered to their homes off campus, FBI agents spent their days analyzing the electronic device found with Neves Valente's body. It contained 4 short videos that Neves Valente had recorded in the storage unit after the murders. In the recordings, he confessed to the murders, though made no specific comment on the murder of the professor. He explained that he had been planning the Brown University shooting for a long time, at least 6 semesters, he said, and he made clear that Brown University was his intended target, but he refused to explain why. In fact, Neves Valente showed no remorse and no interest in explaining any of his actions other than to say, "I'm not going to apologize because during my lifetime, no one sincerely apologized to me." The FBI has since released the video transcripts, but their contents remain open to interpretation. He acknowledged that the killings were, quote, "incompetent," and claimed that they were triggered by John's confrontation and that he had no real ideology. He said his only objective was to leave more or less on his own terms and to ensure that he wouldn't be the one who ended up suffering the most from all this. But he never mentioned his former classmate Loureiro. Law enforcement sources have told ABC News that Neves Valente described having 20-year grudges that propelled him to buy guns and carry out shootings. But these aren't mentioned in the videos. Even with the recordings, investigators still don't have a clear motive. Why did he target Brown after more than 2 decades away from the university? Why did he shoot students who had no connection to him? Why Nuno Loureiro, a former classmate who had become a successful physicist? Some believe the answer lies in that last question. Neves Valente was clearly a genius in his classes, yet he had failed to achieve lasting professional success. Loureiro, on the other hand, went from success to success. The most popular theory is that Loureiro represented something that Neves Valente could never achieve. But law enforcement officials emphasized that Loureiro had no recent contact with Neves Valente and described the attack as a deliberate, unilateral act of criminal violence carried out against a victim unconnected to his personal or professional failures. But when Nuno Loureiro's death was publicly linked to Neves Valente, a conspiracy narrative quickly emerged. One you've probably encountered if you followed the story on forums and social media. Within hours of Loureiro's death, some outlets and social media users began speculating that his murder was connected to Iran, geopolitical tensions, or an alleged targeting of pro-Israel academics. Others baselessly claimed that Loureiro was pro-Israel and that he was targeted for that reason. And some speculated that Loureiro's murder was connected to corporate interests in the fusion energy field, or that powerful monopolies were involved. While of course none of the speculation narratives are impossible, there is at this time zero evidence for any of this. Nuno Loureiro never made any public stances on politics, and it is unlikely that there is some shadowy conspiracy targeting MIT nuclear professors. Neves Valente was a software developer with, according to police, some grudges that ate at him. This was most likely the act of a deeply troubled individual who harbored resentment about his own academic and professional failures, fixated on people he felt represented the success he never achieved, and planned violence over decades before finally acting. Neves Valente himself said he had no ideological motive. In the aftermath of the investigation, Providence Mayor Brett Smiley wrote to FBI Director Kash Patel requesting that John receive the full $50,000 reward offered for information leading to the suspect's identification and arrest. Fellow Reddit users on the RR Providence subreddit had already flooded the forum with praise for Reddit Guy. But John has remained anonymous and has declined all requests from the media. Wednesday evening, he posted on Reddit one final time, "Respectfully, I have said all I have to say on the matter to the right people." He never revealed his real name. As of this video, he has given no interviews. He simply did what he thought was right, and then disappeared back into anonymity. As of early January 2026, the FBI has not confirmed whether John will receive the reward. The Bureau maintains a long-standing policy not to comment on whether reward money has been paid and to whom, citing privacy protection and the need to ensure public cooperation with future investigations. January 5, 2026. Rhode Island Hospital announced that all 9 victims who were treated for gunshot wounds had been discharged. The last victim was released in stable condition after spending more than 3 weeks in the hospital. All are expected to survive. As of recording this video, there's no more insight into why this killer decided to pull off such horrific and seemingly random acts of violence. And given the content of his videos, there's no reason to believe we'll find out anytime soon. But the Brown University shooting represents one of the most unusual criminal investigations in recent American history. What is clear is this: in an era of high-tech surveillance, facial recognition software, and billion-dollar law enforcement budgets, it was an ordinary person with sharp eyes, keen intuition, and a Reddit account who solved the case. Law enforcement had every tool imaginable at its disposal. Brown University had 1,200 security cameras. Providence Police had access to 70 automated license plate readers. The FBI brought federal resources, facial recognition technology, and a nationwide network of field offices. There was a $50,000 reward, hundreds of tips, thousands of hours of surveillance footage, an incredible amount of resources, and yet, for 5 days, they couldn't identify the shooter. The case was solved only because a man without a home posted on Reddit. John, whoever he is, had something that cameras and algorithms can never replicate: human intuition. He saw a man in a bathroom and immediately felt something was wrong. He followed that instinct, observed the guy in action, remembered all the details, and when he saw surveillance images released by police, he connected the dots and became a hero. We've reached the end of these investigations. If you found value in this deep dive, please take a moment to leave a comment about which case struck you the most. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you're here for the next one. Thanks for watching. See you in the next investigation.